Chapter 51 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Lester had thought of his predicament earnestly enough, and he would have been satisfied to act soon if it had not been for one of those disrupting influences which sometimes complicate our affairs entered into his Hyde Park domicile. Gerhardt's health began rapidly to fail. Little by little he had been obliged to give up his various duties about the place. Finally he was obliged to take to his bed. He lay in his room, devotedly attended by Jennie and visited constantly by Vesta and occasionally by Lester. There was a window not far from his bed which commanded a charming view of the lawn and one of the surrounding streets, and through this he would gaze by the hour, wondering how the world was getting on without him. He suspected that Woods, the coachman, was not looking after the horses and harnesses as well as he should, that the newspaper carrier was getting negligent in his delivery of the paper, that the furnace man was wasting coal, or he was not giving them enough heat. A score of little petty worries, which were nevertheless real enough to him. He knew how a house should be kept. He was always rigid in his performance of his self-appointed duties, and he was so afraid that things would not go right. Jennie made for him a most imposing and sumptuous dressing gown of basted wool, covered with dark blue silk, and bought him a pair of soft, thick wool slippers to match. But he did not wear them often. He preferred to lie in bed, read his Bible and the Lutheran papers, and ask Jennie how things were getting along. "I want you should go down in the basement and see what that fella is doing. He's not giving us any heat," he would complain. "I'll bet I know what he does. He sits down there and reads, and then he forgets what the fire is doing until it is almost out. The beer is right there where he can take it. You should lock it up. You don't know what kind of man he is. He may be no good." Jennie would protest that the house was fairly comfortable, that the man was a nice, quiet, respectable-looking American, and that if he did drink a little beer it would not matter. Gerhardt would immediately become incensed. "That is always the way," he declared vigorously. "You have no sense of economy. You're always so ready to let things go if I am not there. He is a nice man? How do you know he's a nice man? Does he keep the fire up? No. Does he keep the walk clean? If you don't watch him he will be just like the others, no good. You should go around and see how things are for yourself." "All right, Papa," she would reply in a genial effort to soothe him. "I will. Please don't worry. I'll lock up the beer. Don't you want a cup of coffee now, and some toast?" "No," Gerhardt would sigh immediately. "My stomach, it don't do right. I don't know how I'm going to come out of this." Dr. Macon, the leading physician in the vicinity, and a man of considerable experience and ability, called at Jennie's request and suggested a few simple things: hot milk, a wine tonic, rest. But he told Jennie that she must not expect too much. "You know he is quite well along in years now. He is quite feeble. If he were 20 years younger we might do a great deal for him. As it is, he is quite well off where he is. He may live for some time. He may get up and be around again, and then he may not. We must expect these things. I have never any care as to what may happen to me. I am too old myself." Jennie felt sorry to think that her father might die. She was pleased to think that if he must, it was going to be under such comfortable circumstances. Here at least he could have every care. It soon became evident that this was Gerhardt's last illness, and Jennie thought it her duty to communicate with her brothers and sisters. She wrote Bass that his father was not well, and had a letter from him saying that he was very busy and couldn't come on unless the danger was an immediate one. He went on to say that George was in Rochester working for a wholesale wallpaper house, the Chef Jefferson Company, he thought. Martha and her husband had gone to Boston. Her address was a little suburb named Belmont, just outside the city. William was in Omaha, working for a local electric company. Veronica was married to a man named Albert Sheridan, who was connected with a wholesale drug company in Cleveland. "She never comes to see me," complained Bass, "but I'll let her know." Jennie wrote each one personally. From Veronica and Martha she received brief replies. They were very sorry, and would she let them know if anything happened. George wrote that he could not think of coming to Chicago unless his father was very ill indeed, but that he would like to be informed from time to time how he was getting along. William, as he told Jennie some time afterward, did not get her letter. The progress of the old German's malady toward final dissolution preyed greatly on Jennie's mind, for in spite of the fact that they had been so far apart in times past, they had now grown very close together. Gerhardt had come to realize clearly that his outcast daughter was goodness itself, at least so far as he was concerned. She never quarreled with him, never crossed him in any way. Now that he was sick, she was in and out of his room a dozen times in the evening or an afternoon, seeing whether he was all right, asking how he liked his breakfast or his lunch or his dinner. As he grew weaker, she would sit by him and read, or do her sewing in his room. One day, when she was straightening his pillow, he took her hand and kissed it. He was feeling very weak and despondent. She looked up in astonishment, a lump in her throat. There were tears in her eyes. "You're a good girl, Jennie," he said brokenly. "You've been good to me. I've been hard and cross, but I'm an old man. You forgive me, don't you?" "Oh, papa, please don't," she pleaded, tears welling from her eyes. "You know I have nothing to forgive. I'm the one who has been all wrong." "No, no," he said, and she sank down on her knees beside him and cried. He put his thin yellow hand on her hair. "There, there," he said brokenly. "I understand a lot of things I didn't. We get wiser as we get older." She left the room, ostensibly to wash her face and hands, and cried her eyes out. Was he really forgiving her at last? And she had lied to him so. She tried to be more attentive, but that was impossible. But after this reconciliation he seemed happier and more contented, and they spent a number of happy hours together, just talking. Once he said to her, "You know, I feel just like I did when I was a boy. If it wasn't for my bones, I could get up and dance on the grass." Jennie fairly smiled and sobbed in one breath. "You'll get stronger, papa," she said. "You're going to get well. Then I'll take you out driving." She was so glad she had been able to make him comfortable these last few years. As for Lester, he was affectionate and considerate. "Well, how it is tonight?" he would ask the moment he entered the house. And he would always drop in for a few minutes before dinner to see how the old man was getting along. "He looks pretty well," he would tell Jennie. "He's apt to live some time yet. I wouldn't worry." Vesta also spent much time with her grandfather, for she had come to love him dearly. She would bring her books, if it didn't disturb him too much, and recite some of her lessons, or she would leave his door open and play for him on the piano. Lester had bought her a handsome music box also, which she would sometimes carry to his room and play for him. At times he wearied of everything and everybody save Jennie, and he wanted to be alone with her. She would sit beside him quite still and sew. She could see plainly that the end was only a little way off. Gerhardt, true to his nature, took into consideration all the various arrangements contingent upon his death. He wished to be buried in the little Lutheran cemetery, which was several miles farther out on the south side, and he wanted the beloved minister of his church to officiate. "I want everything plain," he said. "Just my black suit and those Sunday shoes of mine, and that black string tie. I don't want anything else. I will be all right." Jennie begged him not to talk of it, but he would. One day at 4 o'clock he had a sudden sinking spell, and at 5 he was dead. Jennie held his hands, watching his labored breathing. Once or twice he opened his eyes to smile at her. "I don't mind going," he said, "in this final hour. I've done what I could." "Don't talk of dying, papa," she pleaded. "It's the end," he said. "You've been good to me. You're a good woman." She heard no other words from his lips. The finish which time thus puts to this troubled life affected Jennie deeply. Strong in her kindly, emotional relationships, Gerhardt had appealed to her not only as her father, but as a friend and counselor. She saw him now in his true perspective, a hard-working, honest, sincere old German who had done his best to raise a troublesome family and lead an honest life. Truly, she had been his one great burden, and she had never really dealt truthfully with him to the end. She wondered now if where he was he could see that she had lied. And would he forgive her? He had called her a good woman. Telegrams were sent to all the children. Bass wired that he was coming, and arrived the next day. The others wired that they could not come, but asked for details, which Jennie wrote. The Lutheran minister was called in to say prayers and fix the time of the burial service. A fat, smug undertaker was commissioned to arrange all the details. Some few neighbor friends called, those who had remained most faithful, and on the second morning following his death the services were held. Lester accompanied Jennie and Vesta and Bass to the little red-brick Lutheran church, and sat stolidly through the rather dry service. He listened wearily to the long discourse on the beauties and rewards of a future life, and stirred irritably when reference was made to a hell. Bass was rather bored, but considerate. He looked upon his father now much as he would on any other man. Only Jennie wept sympathetically. She saw her father in perspective, the long years of trouble he had had, the days in which he had had to saw wood for a living, the days in which he had lived in a factory loft, the little shabby house that they had been compelled to live in 13th Street, the terrible days of suffering they had spent in Laurie Street in Cleveland, his grief over her, his grief over Mrs. Gerhardt, his love and care of Vesta, and finally these last days. Oh, he was a good man, she thought. He meant so well. They sang a hymn, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," and then she sobbed. Lester pulled at her arm. He was moved to the danger line himself by her grief. "You'll have to do better than this," he whispered. "My God, I can't stand it. I'll have to get up and get out." Jennie quieted a little, but the fact that the last visible ties were being broken between her and her father was almost too much. At the grave in the cemetery of the Redeemer, where Lester had immediately arranged to purchase a lot, they saw the plain coffin lowered and the earth shoveled in. Lester looked curiously at the bare trees, the brown dead grass, and the brown soil of the prairie turned up at this simple gravesite. There was no distinction to this burial plot. It was commonplace and shabby, a working man's resting place, but so long as he wanted it, it was all right. He studied Bass's keen, lean face, wondering what sort of career he was cutting out for himself. Bass looked to him like someone who would run a cigar store successfully. He watched Jennie wiping her red eyes, and then he said to himself again, "Well, there is something to her." The woman's emotions were so deep, so real. "There's no explaining a good woman," he said to himself. On the way home, through the wind-swept, dusty streets, he talked of life in general, Bass and Vesta being present. "Jennie takes things too seriously," he said. "She's inclined to be morbid. Life isn't as bad as she makes out with her sensitive feelings. We all have our troubles, and we all have to stand them, some more, some less. We can't assume that anyone is so much better or worse off than anyone else. We all have our share of troubles." "I can't help it," said Jennie. "I feel so sorry for some people." "Jennie was always a little gloomy," put in Bass. He was thinking what a fine figure of a man Lester was, how beautifully they lived, how Jennie had come up in the world. He was thinking that there must be a lot more to her than he had originally thought. Life surely did turn out queer. At one time he thought Jennie was a hopeless failure and no good. "You ought to try to steel yourself to take things as they come along, without going to pieces this way," said Lester finally. Bass thought so too. Jennie stared thoughtfully out of the carriage window. There was the old house now, large and silent without Gerhardt. Just think, she would never see him any more. They finally turned into the drive and entered the library. Jeannette, nervous and sympathetic, served tea. Jennie went to look after various details. She wondered curiously where she would be when she died. End of chapter 51. Chapter 52 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The fact that Gerhardt was dead made no particular difference to Lester, except as it affected Jennie. He had liked the old German for his many sterling qualities, but beyond that he thought nothing of him one way or the other. He took Jennie to a watering place for 10 days to help her recover her spirits, and it was soon after this that he decided to tell her just how things stood with him. He would put the problem plainly before her. It would be easier now, for Jennie had been informed of the disastrous prospects of the real estate deal. She was also aware of his continued interest in Mrs. Gerald. Lester did not hesitate to let Jennie know that he was on very friendly terms with her. Mrs. Gerald had, at first, formally requested him to bring Jennie to see her, but she never had called herself, and Jennie understood quite clearly that it was not to be. Now that her father was dead, she was beginning to wonder what was going to become of her. She was afraid that Lester might not marry her. Certainly he showed no signs of intending to do so. By one of those curious coincidences of thought, Robert also had reached the conclusion that something should be done. He did not for one moment imagine that he could directly work upon Lester. He did not care to try, but he did think that some influence might be brought to bear on Jennie. She was probably amiable to reason. If Lester had not married her already, she must realize full well that he did not intend to do so. Suppose that some responsible third person were to approach her and explain how things were, including, of course, the offer of an independent income. Might she not be willing to leave Lester and end all this trouble? After all, Lester was his brother, and he ought not to lose his fortune. Robert had things very much in his own hands now, and could afford to be generous. He finally decided that Mr. O'Brien, of Knight, Keatley & O'Brien, would be the proper intermediary, for O'Brien was suave, good-natured, and well-meaning, even if he was a lawyer. He might explain to Jennie very delicately just how the family felt, and how much Lester stood to lose if he continued to maintain his connection with her. If Lester had married Jennie, O'Brien would find it out. A liberal provision would be made for her, say 50 or 100,000 or even $150,000. He sent for Mr. O'Brien and gave him his instructions. As one of the executors of Archibald Kane's estate, it was really the lawyer's duty to look into the matter of Lester's ultimate decision. Mr. O'Brien journeyed to Chicago. On reaching the city, he called up Lester and found out to his satisfaction that he was out of town for the day. He went out to the house in Hyde Park and sent in his card to Jennie. She came downstairs in a few minutes, quite unconscious of the import of his message. He greeted her most blandly. "This is Mrs. Kane?" he asked, with an interlocutory jerk of his head. "Yes," replied Jennie. "I am, as you see by my card, Mr. O'Brien, of Knight, Keatley & O'Brien," he began. "We are the attorneys and executors of the late Mr. Kane, Mr. Kane's father. You'll think it rather curious, my coming to you, but under your husband's father's will there were certain conditions stipulated which affect you and Mr. Kane very materially. These provisions are so important that I think you ought to know about them. That is, if Mr. Kane hasn't already told you. Pardon me, but the peculiar nature of them makes me conclude that possibly he hasn't." He paused, a very question mark of a man, every feature of his face an interrogation. "I don't quite understand," said Jennie. "I don't know anything about the will. If there's anything I ought to know, I suppose Mr. Kane will tell me. He hasn't told me anything as yet." "Ah," breathed Mr. O'Brien, highly gratified. "Just as I thought. Now, if you will allow me, I'll go into the matter briefly. Then you can judge for yourself whether you wish to hear the full particulars. Won't you sit down?" They had both been standing. Jennie seated herself, and Mr. O'Brien pulled up a chair near to hers. "Now to begin," he said. "I need not say to you, of course, that there was considerable opposition on the part of Mr. Kane's father to this union between yourself and his son." "I know," Jennie started to say, but she checked herself. She was puzzled, disturbed, a little apprehensive. "Before Mr. Kane Sr. died," he went on, "he indicated to to Mr. Lester Kane that he felt this way. In his will he made certain conditions governing the distribution of his property which made it rather hard for his son, your husband, to come into his rightful share. Ordinarily he would have inherited 1/4 of the Kane Manufacturing Company, worth today in the neighborhood of $1,000,000, perhaps more. Also 1/4 of the other properties, which now aggregate something like $500,000. I believe Mr. Kane Sr. was really very anxious that his son should inherit this property, but owing to the conditions which Mr. Kane's father made, Mr. Lester Kane cannot possibly obtain his share except by complying with a certain wish which his father had expressed." Mr. O'Brien paused, his eyes moving back and forth sideways in their sockets. In spite of the natural prejudice of the situation, he was considerably impressed with Jennie's pleasing appearance. He could see quite plainly why Lester might cling to her in face of all opposition. He continued to study her furtively as he sat there, waiting for her to speak. "And what was that wish?" she finally asked, her nerves becoming just a little tense under the strain of the silence. "I'm glad you were kind enough to ask me that," he went on. "The subject is a very difficult one for me to introduce, very difficult. I come as an emissary of the estate, I might say as one of the executors under the will of Mr. Kane's father. I know how keenly Mr. Kane feels about it. I know how keenly you will probably feel about it. But it is one of those very difficult things which cannot be helped, which must be got over somehow. And while I hesitate very much to say so, I must tell you that Mr. Kane Sr. stipulated in his will that unless... Again his eyes were moving sideways, to and fro. He saw fit to separate from you. He paused to get breath. He could not inherit this or any other sum, or at least only a very minor income of $10,000 a year, and that only on condition that he should marry you. He paused again. "I should add," he went on, that under the will he was given 3 years in which to indicate his intentions. That time is now drawing to a close." He paused, half expecting some outburst of feeling from Jennie, but she only looked at him fixedly, her eyes clouded with surprise, distress, unhappiness. Now she understood. Lester was sacrificing his fortune for her. His recent commercial venture was an effort to rehabilitate himself, to put himself in an independent position. The recent periods of preoccupation, of subtle unrest, and of dissatisfaction over which she had grieved were now explained. He was unhappy. He was brooding over this prospective loss, and he had never told her. So his father had really disinherited him. Mr. O'Brien sat before her, troubled himself. He was very sorry for her, now that he saw the expression on her face. Still, the truth had to come out. She ought to know. "I'm sorry," he said, when he saw that she was not going to make any immediate reply, "that I have been the bearer of such unfortunate news. It is a very painful situation that I find myself in at this moment, I assure you. I bear you no ill will personally. Of course you understand that. The family really bears you no ill will now. I hope you believe that. As I told Mr. Kane at the time the will was read, I considered it most unfair, but of course, as a mere executive under it and counsel for his father, I could do nothing. I really think it best that you should know how things stand, in order that you may help your husband." He paused significantly. "If possible, to some solution. It seems a pity to me, as it does to the various other members of his family, that he should lose all this money." Jennie had turned her head away and was staring at the floor. She faced him now steadily. "He mustn't lose it," she said. "It isn't fair that he should." "I am most delighted to hear you say that, Mrs. Kane," he went on, using for the first time her improbable title as Lester's wife, without hesitation. "I may as well be very frank with you and say that I feared you might take this information in quite another spirit. Of course you know, to begin with, that the Kane family is very clannish. Mrs. Kane, your husband's mother, was a very proud and rather distant woman, and his sisters and brothers are rather set in their notions as to what constitute proper family connections. They look upon his relationship to you as irregular, and pardon me if I appear to be a little cruel, as not generally satisfactory. As you know, there has been so much talk in the last few years that Mr. Kane Sr. did not believe that the situation could ever be nicely adjusted, so far as the family was concerned. He felt that his son had not gone about it right in the first place. One of the conditions of his will was that if your husband—pardon me, if his son did not accept the proposition in regard to separating from you and taking up his rightful share of the estate, then to inherit anything at all, the mere $10,000 a year I mentioned before, he must—pardon me, I seem a little brutal, but not intentionally so—marry you." Jennie winced. It was such a cruel thing to say this to her face. This whole attempt to live together illegally had proved disastrous at every step. There was only one solution to the unfortunate business. She could see that plainly. She must leave him, or he must leave her. There was no other alternative. Lester living on $10,000 a year, it seemed silly. Mr. O'Brien was watching her curiously. He was thinking that Lester both had and had not made a mistake. Why had he not married her in the first place? She was charming. "There is just one other point which I wish to make in this connection, Mrs. Kane," he went on softly and easily. "I see now that it will not make any difference to you, but I am commissioned and in a way constrained to make it. I hope you will take it in the manner in which it is given. I don't know whether you are familiar with your husband's commercial interests or not." "No," said Jennie simply. "Well, in order to simplify matters and to make it easier for you, should you decide to assist your husband to a solution of this very difficult situation, frankly, in case you might possibly decide to leave on your own account and maintain a separate establishment of your own, I am delighted to say that any sum, say. Jennie rose and walked dazedly to one of the windows, clasping her hands as she went. Mr. O'Brien rose also. "Well, be that as it may, in the event of your deciding to end the connection, it has been suggested that any reasonable sum you might name, 50, 75, $100,000, Mr. O'Brien was feeling very generous toward her, would be gladly set aside for your benefit, put in trust as it were, so that you would have it whenever you needed it. You would never want for anything." "Please don't," said Jennie, hurt beyond the power to express herself, unable mentally and physically to listen to another word. "Please don't say any more. Please go away. Let me alone now, please. I can go away. I will. It will be arranged. But please don't talk to me any more, will you?" "I understand how you feel, Mrs. Kane," went on Mr. O'Brien, coming to a keen realization of her sufferings. "I know exactly, believe me. I have said all I intend to say. It has been very hard for me to do this, very hard. I regret the necessity. You have my card. Please note the name. I will come any time you suggest, or you can write me. I will not detain you any longer. I am sorry. I hope you will see fit to say nothing to your husband of my visit. It will be advisable that you should keep your own counsel in the matter. I value his friendship very highly, and I am sincerely sorry." Jennie only stared at the floor. Mr. O'Brien went out into the hall to get his coat. Jennie touched the electric button to summon the maid, and Jeannette came. Jennie went back into the library, and Mr. O'Brien paced briskly down the front walk. When she was really alone, she put her doubled hands to her chin and stared at the floor. The queer design of the silken Turkish rug resolving itself into some curious picture. She saw herself in a small cottage somewhere, alone with Vesta. She saw Lester living in another world, and beside him Mrs. Gerald. She saw this house vacant, and then a long stretch of time, and then— "Oh," she sighed, choking back her desire to cry. With her hands she brushed away a hot tear from each eye. Then she got up. "It must be," she said to herself in thought. "It must be. It should have been so long ago." And then, "Oh, thank God that Papa is dead. Anyhow, he did not live to see this." End of chapter 52. Chapter 53 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The explanation which Lester had concluded to be inevitable, whether it led to separation or legalization of their hitherto banal condition, followed quickly upon the appearance of Mr. O'Brien. On the day Mr. O'Brien called, he had gone on a journey to Hegewisch, a small manufacturing town in Wisconsin, where he had been invited to witness the trial of a new motor intended to operate elevators, with a view to possible investment. When he came out to the house, interested to tell Jennie something about it, even in spite of the fact that he was thinking of leaving her, he felt a sense of depression everywhere. For Jennie, in spite of the serious and sensible conclusions she had reached, was not one who could conceal her feelings easily. She was brooding sadly over her proposed action, realizing that it was best to leave, but finding it hard to summon the courage which would let her talk to him about it. She could not go on without telling him what she thought. He ought to want to leave her. She was absolutely convinced that this one course of action, separation, was necessary and advisable. She could not think of him as daring to make a sacrifice of such proportions for her sake, even if he wanted to. It was impossible. It was astonishing to her that he had let things go along as dangerously and silently as he had. When he came in, Jennie did her best to greet him with her accustomed smile, but it was a pretty poor imitation. "Everything all right?" she asked, using her customary phrase of inquiry. "Quite," he answered. "How are things with you?" "Oh, just the same." She walked with him to the library, and he poked at the open fire with a long-handled poker before turning to survey the room generally. It was 5 o'clock on a January afternoon. Jennie had gone to one of the windows to lower the shade. As she came back, he looked at her critically. "You're not quite your usual self, are you?" he asked, sensing something out of the common in her attitude. "Why, yes, I feel all right," she replied, but there was a peculiar, uneven motion to the movement of her lips, a rippling tremor, which was unmistakable to him. "I think I know better than that," he said, still gazing at her steadily. "What's the trouble? Anything happened?" She turned away from him a moment to get her breath and collect her senses. Then she faced him again. "There is something," she managed to say. "I have to tell you something." "I know you have," he agreed, half smiling, but with a feeling that there was much of grave import back of this. "What is it?" She was silent for a moment, biting her lips. She did not quite know how to begin. Finally she broke the spell with, "There was a man here yesterday, a Mr. O'Brien of Cincinnati. Do you know him?" "Yes, I know him. What did he want?" "He came to talk to me about you and your father's will." She paused, for his face clouded immediately. "Why the devil should he be talking to you about my father's will?" he exclaimed. "What did he have to say?" "Please don't get angry, Lester," said Jennie calmly, for she realized that she must remain absolute mistress of herself if anything were to be accomplished toward the resolution of her problem. "He wanted to tell me what a sacrifice you were making," she went on. "He wished to show me that there was only a little time left before you would lose your inheritance. Don't you want to act pretty soon? Don't you want to leave me?" "Damn him," said Lester fiercely. "What the devil does he mean by putting his nose in my private affairs? Can't they let me alone?" He shook himself angrily. "Damn them!" he exclaimed again. "This is some of Robert's work. Why should Knight, Keatley, and O'Brien be meddling in my affairs? This whole business is going to be a nuisance." He was in a boiling rage in a moment, as was shown by his darkening skin and sulphurous eyes. Jennie trembled before his anger. She did not know what to say. He came to himself sufficiently after a time to add, "Well, just what did he tell you?" "He said that if you married me you would only get 10,000 a year. That if you didn't and still lived with me you would get nothing at all. If you would leave me, or I would leave you, you would get all of 1.5 million. Don't you think you had better leave me now?" She had not intended to propound this leading question so quickly, but it came out as a natural climax to the situation. She realized instantly that if he were really in love with her he would answer with an emphatic no. If he didn't care, he would hesitate, he would delay, he would seek to put off the evil day of reckoning. "I don't see that," he retorted irritably. "I don't see that there's any need for either interference or hasty action. What I object to is their coming here and mixing in my private affairs." Jennie was cut to the quick by his indifference, his wrath instead of affection. To her the main point at issue was her leaving him or his leaving her. To him this recent interference was obviously the chief matter for discussion and consideration. The meddling of others before he was ready to act was the terrible thing. She had hoped, in spite of what she had seen, that possibly, because of the long time they had lived together and the things which, in a way, they had endured together, he might have come to care for her deeply, that she had stirred some emotion in him which would never brook real separation, though some seeming separation might be necessary. He had not married her, of course, but then there had been so many things against them. Now, in this final hour, anyhow, he might have shown that he cared deeply, even if he deemed it necessary to let her go. She felt for the time being as if, for all that she had lived with him so long, she did not understand him, and yet, in spite of this feeling, she knew also that she did. He cared in his way. He could not care for anyone enthusiastically and demonstratively. He could care enough to seize her and take her to himself as he had, but he could not care enough to keep her if something more important appeared. He was debating her fate now. She was in a quandary, hurt, bleeding, but for once in her life determined. Whether he wanted to or not, she must not let him make the sacrifice. She must leave him, if he would not leave her. It was not important enough that she should stay. There might be but one answer, but might he not show affection? "Don't you think you had better act soon?" she continued, hoping that some word of feeling would come from him. "There is only a little time left, isn't there?" Jennie nervously pushed a book to and fro on the table, her fear that she would not be able to keep up appearances troubling her greatly. It was hard for her to know what to do or say. Lester was so terrible when he became angry. Still, it ought not to be so hard for him to go, now that he had Mrs. Gerald. If he only wished to do so, and he ought to. His fortune was so much more important to him than anything she could be. "Don't worry about that," he replied stubbornly, his wrath at his brother and his family and O'Brien still holding him. "There is time enough. I don't know what I want to do yet. I like the effrontery of these people, but I won't talk any more about it. Isn't dinner nearly ready?" He was so injured in his pride that he scarcely took the trouble to be civil. He was forgetting all about her and what she was feeling. He hated his brother Robert for this affront. He would have enjoyed wringing the necks of Messrs. Knight, Keatley, and O'Brien, singly and collectively. The question could not be dropped for good and all, and it came up again at dinner, after Jennie had done her best to collect her thoughts and quiet her nerves. They could not talk very freely because of Vesta and Jeannette, but she managed to get in a word or two. "I could take a little cottage somewhere," she suggested softly, hoping to find him in a modified mood. "I would not want to stay here. I would not know what to do with a big house like this alone." "I wish you wouldn't discuss this business any longer, Jennie," he persisted. "I'm in no mood for it. I don't know that I'm going to do anything of the sort. I don't know what I'm going to do." He was so sour and obstinate because of O'Brien that she finally gave it up. Vesta was astonished to see her stepfather, usually so courteous, in so grim a mood. Jennie felt a curious sense that she might hold him if she would, for he was doubting, but she knew also that she should not wish. It was not fair to him. It was not fair to herself, or kind, or decent. "Oh yes, Lester, you must," she pleaded at a later time. "I won't talk about it any more, but you must. I won't let you do anything else." There were hours when it came up afterward. Every day, in fact, in their boudoir, in the library, in the dining room, at breakfast, but not always in words. Jennie was worried. She was looking the worry she felt. She was sure that he should be made to act. Since he was showing more kindly consideration for her, she was all the more certain that he should act soon. Just how to go about it she did not know, but she looked at him longingly, trying to help him make up his mind. She would be happy, she assured herself, She would be happy thinking that he was happy once she was away from him. He was a good man, most delightful in everything, perhaps, save his gift of love. He really did not love her, could not, perhaps, after all that had happened, even though she loved him most earnestly. But his family had been most brutal in their opposition, and this had affected his attitude. She could understand that, too. She could see now how his big, strong brain might be working in a circle. He was too decent to be absolutely brutal about this thing and leave her, too really considerate to look sharply after his own interests as he should, or hers, but he ought to. "You must decide, Lester," she kept saying to him from time to time. "You must let me go. What difference does it make? I will be all right. Maybe when this thing is all over you might want to come back to me. If you do, I will be there." "I'm not ready to come to a decision," was his invariable reply. "I don't know that I want to leave you. This money is important, of course, but money isn't everything. I can live on $10,000 a year if necessary. I've done it in the past." "Oh, but you're so much more placed in the world now, Lester," she argued. "You can't do it. Look how much it costs to run this house alone. And $1.5 million. Why, I wouldn't let you think of losing that. I'll go myself first." "Where would you think of going if it came to that?" he asked curiously. "Oh, I'd find some place. Do you remember that little town of Sandwood, this side of Kenosha? I have often thought that it would be a pleasant place to live." "I don't like to think of this," he said finally, in an outburst of frankness. "It doesn't seem fair. The conditions have all been against this union of ours. I suppose I should have married you in the first place. I'm sorry now that I didn't." Jennie choked in her throat, but said nothing. "Anyhow, this won't be the last of it if I can help it," he concluded. He was thinking that the storm might blow over, once he had the money, and then... But he hated compromises and subterfuges. It came by degrees to be understood that, toward the end of February, she should look around at Sandwood and see what she could find. She was to have ample means, he told her, everything she wanted. After a time he might come out and visit her occasionally, and he was determined in his heart that he would make some people pay for the trouble they had caused him. He decided to send for Mr. O'Brien shortly and talk things over. He wanted, for his personal satisfaction, to tell him what he thought of him. At the same time, in the background of his mind, moved the shadowy figure of Mrs. Gerald, charming, sophisticated, well placed in every sense of the word. He did not want to give her the broad reality of full thought, but she was always there. He thought and thought. "Perhaps I'd better," he half concluded. When February came, he was ready to act. End of chapter 53. Chapter 54 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The little town of Sandwood, this side of Kenosha, as Jennie had expressed it, was only a short distance from Chicago, an hour and 15 minutes by the local train. It had a population of some 300 families, dwelling in small cottages which were scattered over a pleasant area of lakeshore property. They were not rich people. The houses were not worth more than from $3,000 to $5,000 each, but in most cases they were harmoniously constructed, and the surrounding trees, green for the entire year, gave them a pleasing summery appearance. Jennie, at the time they had passed by there—it was an outing taken behind a pair of fast horses—had admired the look of the little white church steeple, set down among green trees, and the gentle rocking of the boats upon the summer water. "I should like to live in a place like this sometime," she had said to Lester, and he had made the comment that it was a little too peaceful for him. "I can imagine getting to the place where I might like this, but not now. It's too withdrawn." Jennie thought of that expression afterwards. It came to her when she thought that the world was trying. If she had to be alone ever and could afford it, she would like to live in a place like Sandwood. There she would have a little garden, some chickens perhaps, a tall pole with a pretty birdhouse on it, and flowers and trees and green grass everywhere about. If she could have a little cottage in a place like this, which commanded a view of the lake, she could sit of a summer evening and sew. Vesta could play about or come home from school. She might have a few friends, or not any. She was beginning to think that she could do very well living alone if it were not for Vesta's social needs. Books were pleasant things. She was finding that out. Books like Irving's Sketch Book, Lamb's Elia, and Hawthorne's Twice Told Tales. Vesta was coming to be quite a musician in her way, having a keen sense of the delicate and refined in musical composition. She had a natural sense of harmony and a love for those songs and instrumental compositions which reflected sentimental and passionate moods, and she could sing and play quite well. Her voice was, of course, quite untrained. She was only 14, but it was pleasant to listen to. She was beginning to show the combined traits of her mother and father, Jennie's gentle, speculative turn of mind, combined with Brander's vivacity of spirit and innate executive capacity. She could talk to her mother in a sensible way about things, nature, books, dress, love, and from her developing tendencies Jennie caught keen glimpses of the new worlds which Vesta was to explore. The nature of modern school life, its consideration of various divisions of knowledge, music, science, all came to Jennie watching her daughter take up new themes. Vesta was evidently going to be a woman of considerable ability, not irritably aggressive, but self-constructive. She would be able to take care of herself. All this pleased Jennie and gave her great hopes for Vesta's future. The cottage, which was finally secured at Sandwood, was only a story and a half in height, but it was raised upon red brick piers, between which were set green lattices and about which ran a veranda. The house was long and narrow, its full length, some 5 rooms in a row, facing the lake. There was a dining room with windows opening even with the floor, a large library with built-in shelves for books, and a parlor whose 3 large windows afforded air and sunshine at all times. The plot of ground in which this cottage stood was 100 feet square and ornamented with a few trees. The former owner had laid out flower beds and arranged green hardwood tubs for the reception of various hardy plants and vines. The house was painted white, with green shutters and green shingles. It had been Lester's idea, since this thing must be, that Jennie might keep the house in Hyde Park just as it was, but she did not want to do that. She could not think of living there alone. The place was too full of memories. At first she did not think she would take anything much with her, but she finally saw that it was advisable to do as Lester suggested, to fit out the new place with a selection of silverware, hangings, and furniture from the Hyde Park house. "You have no idea what you will or may want," he said. "Take everything. I certainly don't want any of it." A lease of the cottage was taken for 2 years, together with an option for an additional 5 years, including the privilege of purchase. So long as he was letting her go, Lester wanted to be generous. He could not think of her as wanting for anything, and he did not propose that she should. His one troublesome thought was, what explanation was to be made to Vesta? He liked her very much and wanted her life kept free of complications. "Why not send her off to a boarding school until spring?" he suggested once. But owing to the lateness of the season, this was abandoned as inadvisable. Later they agreed that business affairs made it necessary for him to travel and for Jennie to move. Later Vesta could be told that Jennie had left him for any reason she chose to give. It was a trying situation, all the more bitter to Jennie because she realized that in spite of the wisdom of its indifference to her was involved, he really did not care enough, as much as he cared. The relationship of man and woman, which we study so passionately in the hope of finding heaven knows what key to the mystery of existence, holds no more difficult or trying situations than of this mutual compatibility broken or disrupted by untoward conditions, which in themselves have so little to do with the real force and beauty of the relationship itself. These days of final dissolution, in which this household, so charmingly arranged, the scene of so many pleasant activities, was literally going to pieces, was a period of great trial to both Jennie and Lester. On her part it was one of intense suffering, for she was of that stable nature that rejoices to fix itself in a serviceable and harmonious relationship, and then to stay so. For her life was made up of those mystic cords of sympathy and memory which bind up the transient elements of nature into a harmonious and enduring scene. One of those cords, this home was her home, united and made beautiful by her affection and consideration for each person and every object. Now the time had come when it must cease. If she had ever had anything before in her life which had been like this, it might have been easier to part with it now, though, as she had proved, Jennie's affections were not based in any way upon material considerations. Her love of life and of personality were free from the taint of selfishness. She went among these various rooms, selecting this rug, that set of furniture, this and that ornament, wishing all the time with all her heart and soul that it need not be. Just to think, in a little while Lester would not come any more of an evening. She would not need to get up first of a morning and see that coffee was made for her lord, that the table in the dining room looked just so. It had been a habit of hers to arrange a bouquet for the table out of the richest blooming flowers of the conservatory, and she had always felt in doing it that it was particularly for him. Now it would be not necessary any more, not for him. When one is accustomed to wait for the sound of a certain carriage wheel of an evening grating upon your carriage drive, when one is used to listen at 11, 12, and 1, waking naturally and joyfully to the echo of a certain step on the stair, the separation, the ending of these things, is keen with pain. These were the thoughts that were running through Jennie's brain hour after hour and day after day. Lester, on his part, was suffering in another fashion. His was not the sorrow of lacerated affection, of discarded and despised love, but of that painful sense of unfairness which comes to one who knows that he is making a sacrifice of the virtues, kindness, loyalty, affection, to policy. Policy was dictating a very splendid course of action from one point of view. Free of Jennie, providing for her admirably, he was free to go his way, taking to himself the mass of affairs which come naturally with great wealth. He could not help thinking of the 1,001 little things which Jennie had been accustomed to do for him, the 101 comfortable and pleasant and delightful things she meant to him. The virtues which she possessed were quite dear to his mind. He had gone over them time and again. Now he was compelled to go over them finally, to see that she was suffering without making a sign. Her manner and attitude toward him these last days were quite the same as they had always been, no more, no less. She was not indulging in private hysterics, as another woman might have done. She was not pretending a fortitude in suffering she did not feel, showing him one face while wishing him to see another behind it. She was calm, gentle, considerate, thoughtful of him. Where would he go and what would he do, without irritating him by her inquiries? He was struck quite favorably by her ability to take a large situation largely, and he admired her. There was something to this woman, let the world think what it might. It was a shame that her life was passed under such a troubled star. Still a great world was calling him. The sound of its voice was in his ears. It had on occasion showed him its bared teeth. Did he really dare to hesitate? The last hour came when, having made excuse to this and that neighbor, when having spread the information that they were going abroad, when Lester had engaged rooms at the auditorium, and the mass of furniture which could not be used had gone to storage, that it was necessary to say farewell to this Hyde Park domicile. Jennie had visited Sandwood in company with Lester several times. He had carefully examined the character of the place. He was satisfied that it was nice but lonely. Spring was at hand. The flowers would be something. She was going to keep a gardener and a man of all work. Vesta would be with her. "Very well," he said. "Only I want you to be comfortable." In the meantime Lester had been arranging his personal affairs. He had notified Messrs. Knight, Keatley, and O'Brien, through his own attorney, Mr. Watson, that he would expect them to deliver his share of his father's securities on a given date. He had made up his mind that as long as he was compelled by circumstances to do this thing, he would do a number of other things equally ruthless. He would probably marry Mrs. Gerald. He would sit as a director in the United Carriage Company. With his share of stock, it would be impossible to keep him out. If he had Mrs. Gerald's money, he would become a controlling factor in the United Traction of Cincinnati, in which his brother was heavily interested, and in the Western Steel Works, of which his brother was now a leading adviser. What a different figure he would be now from that which he had been during the past few years. Jennie was depressed to the point of despair. She was tremendously lonely. This home had meant so much to her. When she first came here, and neighbors had begun to drop in, she had imagined herself on the threshold of a great career, that some day, possibly, Lester would marry her. Now blow after blow had been delivered, and the home and dream were a ruin. Gerhardt was gone. Jeannette, Harry Ward, and Mrs. Frizzle had been discharged. The furniture for good part was in storage, and for her, practically, Lester was no more. She realized clearly that he would not come back. If he could do this thing now, even considerately, he could do much more when he was free, and always later. Immersed in his great affairs, he would forget, of course. And why not? She did not fit in. Had not everything illustrated that to her? Love was not enough in this world. That was so plain. One needed education, wealth, training, the ability to fight and scheme. She did not want to do that. She could not. The day came when the house was finally closed, and the old life was at an end. Lester traveled with Jennie to Sandwood. He spent some little while in the house trying to get her used to the idea of change. It was not so bad. He intimated that he would come again soon, but he went away, and all his words were as nothing against the fact of the actual and spiritual separation. When Jennie saw him going down the brick walk that afternoon, his solid conservative figure clad in a new tweed suit, his overcoat on his arm, self-reliance and prosperity written all over him, she thought that she would die. She had kissed Lester good-bye and had wished him joy, prosperity, peace. Then she made an excuse to go to her bedroom. Vesta came after a time to seek her, but now her eyes were quite dry. Everything had subsided to a dull ache. The new life was actually begun for her, a life without Lester, without Gerhardt, without anyone save Vesta. What curious things have happened to me, she thought, as she went into the kitchen, for she had determined to do at least some of her own work. She needed this distraction. She did not want to think. If it were not for Vesta, she would have sought some regular outside employment. Anything to keep from brooding, for in that direction lay madness. End of chapter 54. Chapter 55 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The social and business worlds of Chicago, Cincinnati, Cleveland, and other cities saw, during the year or two which followed the breaking of his relationship with Jennie, a curious rejuvenation in the social and business spirit of Lester Kane. He had become rather distant and indifferent to certain personages and affairs while he was living with her, but now he suddenly appeared again, armed with authority from a number of sources, looking into this and that matter with the air of one who has the privilege of power, and showing himself to be quite a personage from the point of view of finance and commerce. He was older, of course. It must be admitted that he was in some respects a mentally altered Lester. Up to the time he had met Jennie, he was full of the assurance of the man who had never known defeat. To have been reared in luxury as he had been, to have seen only the pleasant side of society, which is so persistent and so deluding where money is concerned, to have been in the run of big affairs, not because one has created them, but because one is a part of them, and because they are one's birthright, like the air one breathes, could not help but create one of those illusions of solidarity which is apt to befog the clearest brain. It is so hard for us to know what we have not seen. It is so difficult for us to feel what we have not experienced. Like this world of ours, which seems so solid and persistent solely because we have no knowledge of the power which creates it. Lester's world seemed solid and persistent and real enough to him. It was only when the storm set in and the winds of adversity blew and he found himself facing the armed forces of convention that he realized he might be mistaken as to the value of his personality, that his private desires and opinions were as nothing in the face of a public conviction that he was wrong. The race spirit, or social avatar, the Zeitgeist as the Germans term it, manifested itself as something having a system in charge, and the organization of society began to show itself to him as something based on possibly a spiritual, or at least superhuman counterpart. He could not fly in the face of it. He could not deliberately ignore its mandates. The people of his time believed that some particular form of social arrangement was necessary, and unless he complied with that, he could, as he saw, readily become a social outcast. His own father and mother had turned on him, his brothers and sisters, society, his friends. Dear heaven, what a to-do this action of his had created! Why, even the fates seemed adverse. His real estate venture was one of the most fortuitously unlucky things he had ever heard of. Why? Were the gods battling on the side of a to him unimportant social arrangement? Apparently. Anyhow, he had been compelled to quit. And here he was, vigorous, determined, somewhat battered by the experience, but still forceful and worthwhile. And it was a part of the penalty that he had become measurably soured by what had occurred. He was feeling that he had been compelled to do the first ugly, brutal thing of his life. Jennie deserved better of him. It was a shame to forsake her after all the devotion she had manifested. Truly, she had played a finer part than he. Worst of all, his deed could not be excused on the grounds of necessity. He could have lived on $10,000 a year. He could have done without the millions and more which was now his. He could have done without the society, the pleasures of which had always been a lure. He could have, but he had not, and he had complicated it all with the thought of another woman. Was she as good as Jennie? That was a question which always rose before him. Was she as kindly? Wasn't she deliberately scheming under his very eyes to win him away from the woman who was as good as his wife? Was that admirable? Was it a thing a truly big woman would do? Was she good enough for him after all? Ought he to marry her? Ought he to marry anyone, seeing that he really owed a spiritual, if not legal, allegiance to Jennie? Was it worth while for any woman to marry him? These things turned in his brain. They haunted him. He could not shut out the fact that he was doing a cruel and unlovely thing. Material error in the first place was now becoming complicated with spiritual error. He was attempting to right the first by committing the second. Could it be done to his own satisfaction? Would it pay mentally and spiritually? Would it bring him peace of mind? He was thinking. All the while he was readjusting his life to the old, or perhaps better yet, new conditions, and he was not feeling any happier. As a matter of fact, he was feeling worse, grim, revengeful. If he married Letty, he thought at times, it would be to use her fortune as a club to knock other enemies over the head, and he hated to think that he was marrying her for that. He took up his abode at the Auditorium, visited Cincinnati in a distant and aggressive spirit, sat in council with a board of directors, wishing that he were more at peace with himself, more interested in life, but he did not change his policy in regard to Jennie. Of course, Mrs. Gerald had been vitally interested in Lester's rehabilitation. She waited tactfully some little time before sending him any word. Finally, she ventured to write him at the Hyde Park address, as if she did not know where he was, asking, "Where are you?" By this time Lester had become slightly accustomed to the change in his life. He was saying to himself that he needed sympathetic companionship, the companionship of a woman, of course. Social invitations had begun to come to him now that he was alone, and that his financial connections were so obviously restored. He had made his appearance, accompanied only by a Japanese valet, at several country houses, the best sign that he was once more a single man. No reference was made by anyone to the past. On receiving Mrs. Gerald's note, he decided that he ought to go and see her. He had treated her rather shabbily. For months preceding his separation from Jennie, he had not gone near her. Even now he waited until time brought a phoned invitation to dinner. This he accepted. Mrs. Gerald was at her best as a hostess at her perfectly appointed dinner table. Albani, the pianist, was there on this occasion, together with Adam Rascavage, the sculptor, a visiting scientist from England, Sir Nelson Keyes, and, curiously enough, Mr. and Mrs. Barry Dodge, whom Lester had not met socially in several years. Mrs. Gerald and Lester exchanged the joyful greetings of those who understand each other thoroughly and are happy in each other's company. "Aren't you ashamed of yourself, sir," she said to him when he made his appearance, "to treat me so indifferently? You are going to be punished for this." "What's the damage?" he smiled. "I've been extremely rushed. I suppose something like 90 stripes will serve me about right." "90 stripes indeed," she retorted. "You're letting yourself off easy. What is it they do to evildoers in Siam?" "Boil them in oil, I suppose." "Well, anyhow, that's more like it. I'm thinking of something terrible." "Be sure and tell me when you decide," he laughed, and passed on to be presented to distinguished strangers by Mrs. De Lincum, who aided Mrs. Gerald in receiving. The talk was stimulating. Lester was always at his ease intellectually, and this mental atmosphere revived him. Presently he turned to greet Barry Dodge, who was standing at his elbow. Dodge was all cordiality. "Where are you now?" he asked. "We haven't seen you in—oh, when? Mrs. Dodge is waiting to have a word with you." Lester noticed the change in Dodge's attitude. "Some time, that's sure," he replied easily. "I'm living at the Auditorium." "I was asking after you the other day. You know Jackson Du Bois? Of course you do. We were thinking of running up into Canada for some hunting. Why don't you join us?" "I can't," replied Lester. "Too many things on hand just now. Later, surely." Dodge was anxious to continue. He had seen Lester's election as a director of the C.H.&D. Obviously, he was coming back into the world. But dinner was announced, and Lester sat at Mrs. Gerald's right hand. "Aren't you coming to pay me a dinner call some afternoon after this?" asked Mrs. Gerald confidentially, when the conversation was brisk at the other end of the table. "I am indeed," he replied, "and shortly. Seriously, I've been wanting to look you up. You understand, though, how things are now?" "I do. I've heard a great deal. That's why I want you to come. We need to talk together." 10 days later he did call. He felt as if he must talk with her. He was feeling bored and lonely. His long home life with Jennie had made hotel life objectionable. He felt as though he must find a sympathetic, intelligent ear, and where better than here? Letty was all ears for his troubles. She would have pillowed his solid head upon her breast in a moment if that had been possible. "Well," he said, when the usual fencing preliminaries were over, "what will you have me say in explanation?" "Have you burned your bridges behind you?" she asked. "I'm not so sure," he replied gravely, "and I can't say that I'm feeling any too joyous about the matter as a whole." "I thought as much," she replied. "I knew how it would be with you. I can see you wading through this mentally. Lester, I have been watching you every step of the way, wishing you peace of mind. These things are always so difficult, but don't you know I am still sure it's for the best? It was never right the other way. It never could be. You couldn't afford to sink back into a mere shellfish life. You are not organized temperamentally for that any more than I am. You may regret what you are doing now, but you would have regretted the other thing quite as much and more. You couldn't work your life out that way now, could you?" "I don't know about that, Letty. Really, I don't. I wanted to come and see you for a long time, but I didn't think I ought to. The fight was outside. You know what I mean?" "Yes, indeed I do," she said soothingly. "It's still inside. I haven't gotten over it. I don't know whether this financial business binds me sufficiently or not. I'll be frank and tell you that I can't say I love her entirely, but I'm sorry, and that's something." "She's comfortably provided for, of course," she commented rather than inquired. "Everything she wants. Jennie is of a peculiar disposition. She doesn't want much. She's retiring by nature and doesn't care for show. I've taken a cottage for her at Sandwood, a little place north of here on the lake, and there's plenty of money in trust, but of course she knows she can live anywhere she pleases. I understand exactly how she feels, Lester. I know how you feel. She is going to suffer very keenly for a while. We all do when we have to give up the thing we love. But we can get over it, and we do. At least we can live. She will. It will go hard at first, but after a while she will see how it is, and she won't feel any the worse toward you." "Jennie will never reproach me. I know that," he replied. "I'm the one who will do the reproaching. I'll be abusing myself for some time. The trouble is with my peculiar turn of mind. I can't tell, for the life of me, how much of this disturbing feeling of mine is habit, the condition I'm accustomed to, and how much is sympathy. I sometimes think I'm the most pointless individual in the world. I think too much." "Poor Lester," she said tenderly. "Well, I understand for one. You're lonely living where you are, aren't you?" "I am that," he replied. "Why not come and spend a few days down at West Baden with me? I'm going there." "When?" he inquired. "Next Tuesday." "Let me see," he replied. "I'm not sure that I can." He consulted his notebook. "I could come Thursday for a few days." "Why not do that? You need company. We can walk and talk things out down there. Will you?" "Yes, I will," he replied. She came toward him, trailing a lavender lounging robe. "You're such a solemn philosopher, sir," she observed comfortably, working through all the ramifications of things. "Why do you? You were always like that." "I can't help it," he replied. "It's my nature to think." "Well, one thing I know," and she tweaked his ear gently. "You're not going to make another mistake through sympathy, if I can help it," she said daringly. "You're going to stay disentangled long enough to give yourself a chance to think out what you want to do. You must. And I wish for one thing you'd take over the management of my affairs. You could advise me so much better than my lawyer." He arose and walked to the window, turning to look back at her solemnly. "I know what you want," he said doggedly. "And why shouldn't I?" she demanded, again approaching him. She looked at him pleadingly, defiantly. "Yes, why shouldn't I?" "You don't know what you're doing," he grumbled, but kept on looking at her. She stood there, attractive as a woman of her age could be, wise, considerate, full of friendship and affection. "Letty," he said, "you ought not want to marry me. I'm not worth it. Really, I'm not. I'm too cynical, too indifferent. It won't be worth anything in the long run." "It will be worth something to me," she insisted. "I know what you are. Anyhow, I don't care. I want you." He took her hands, then her arms. Finally he drew her to him and put his arms about her waist. "Poor Letty," he said. "I'm not worth it. You'll be sorry." "No, I'll not," she replied. "I know what I'm doing. I don't care what you think you are worth." She laid her cheek on his shoulder. "I want you." "If you keep on, I venture to say you'll have me," he returned. He bent and kissed her. "Oh!" she exclaimed, and hid her hot face against his breast. "This is bad business," he thought, even as he held her within the circle of his arms. "It isn't what I ought to be doing." Still he held her, and now when she offered her lips coaxingly, he kissed her again and again. End of chapter 55. Chapter 56 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. It is difficult to say whether Lester might not have returned to Jennie after all, but for certain influential factors. After a time, with his control of his portion of the estate firmly settled in his hands, and the storm of original feeling forgotten, he was well aware that diplomacy, if he ignored his natural tendency to fulfill even implied obligations, could readily bring about an arrangement whereby he and Jennie could be together. But he was haunted by the sense of what might be called an important social opportunity, in the form of Mrs. Gerald. He was compelled to set over against his natural tendency toward Jennie a consciousness of what he was ignoring in the personality and fortunes of her rival, who was one of the most significant and interesting figures on the social horizon. For think as he would, these two women were now persistently opposed in his consciousness. The one polished, sympathetic, philosophic, schooled in all the niceties of polite society, with the means to gratify her every wish. The other natural, sympathetic, emotional, with no schooling in the ways of polite society, but with a feeling for the beauty of life and the lovely things in human relationship which made her beyond any question an exceptional woman. Mrs. Gerald saw it and admitted it. Her criticism of Lester's relationship with Jennie was not that she was not worth while, but that conditions made it impolitic. On the other hand, a union with her was an ideal climax for his social aspirations. This would bring everything out right. He would be as happy with her as he would be with Jennie, almost, and he would have the satisfaction of knowing that this Western social and financial world held no more significant figure than himself. It was not wise to delay either this latter excellent solution of his material problems, and after thinking it over long and seriously, he finally concluded that he would not. He had already done Jennie the irreparable wrong of leaving her. What difference did it make if he did this also? She was possessed of everything she could possibly want outside of himself. She had herself deemed it advisable for him to leave. By such figments of the brain, in the face of unsettled and disturbing conditions, he was becoming used to the idea of a new alliance. The thing which prevented an eventual resumption of the relationship in some form with Jennie was the constant presence of Mrs. Gerald. Circumstances conspired to make her the logical solution of his mental quandary at this time. Alone he could do nothing save to make visits here and there, and he did not care to do that. He was too indifferent mentally to gather about him as a bachelor that atmosphere which he enjoyed and which a woman like Miss Gerald could so readily provide. United with her, it was simple enough. Their home then, wherever it was, would be full of clever people. He would need to do little save to appear and enjoy it. She understood quite as well as anyone how he liked to live. She enjoyed to meet the people he enjoyed meeting. There were so many things they could do together nicely. He visited West Baden at the same time she did, as she suggested. He gave himself over to her in Chicago for dinners, parties, drives. Her house was quite as much his own as hers. She made him feel so. She talked to him about her affairs, showing him exactly how they stood, and why she wished him to intervene in this and that matter. She did not wish him to be much alone. She did not want him to think or regret. She came to represent to him comfort, forgetfulness, rest from care. With the others he visited at her house occasionally, and it gradually became rumored about that he would marry her. Because of the fact that there had been so much discussion of his previous relationship, Letty decided that if ever this occurred it should be a quiet affair. She wanted a simple explanation in the papers of how it had come about, and then afterward, when things were normal again and gossip had subsided, she would enter on a dazzling social display for his sake. "Why not let us get married in April and go abroad for the summer?" she asked once, after they had reached a silent understanding that marriage would eventually follow. "Let's go to Japan. Then we can come back in the fall and take a house on the Drive." Lester had been away from Jennie so long now that the first severe wave of self-reproach had passed. He was still doubtful, but he preferred to stifle his misgivings. "Very well," he replied, almost jokingly. "Only don't let there be any fuss about it." "Do you really mean that, sweet?" she exclaimed, looking over at him. They had been spending the evening together quietly, reading and chatting. "I've thought about it a long while," he replied. "I don't see why not." She came over to him and sat on his knee, putting her arms upon his shoulders. "I can scarcely believe you said that," she said, looking at him curiously. "Shall I take it back?" he asked. "No, no. It is agreed for April now, and we'll go to Japan. You can't change your mind. There won't be any fuss. But my, what a trousseau I will prepare!" He smiled a little constrainedly as she tousled his head. There was a missing note somewhere in this gamut of happiness. Perhaps it was because he was getting old. End of chapter 56. Chapter 57 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. In the meantime Jennie was going her way, settling herself in the markedly different world in which henceforth she was to move. It seemed a terrible thing at first, this life without Lester. Despite her own strong individuality, her ways had become so involved with his that there seemed to be no possibility of disentangling them. Constantly she was with him in thought and action, just as though they had never separated. Where was he now? What was he doing? What was he saying? How was he looking? In the mornings when she awoke, it was with the sense that he must be beside her. At night, as if she could not go to bed alone. He would come after a while, surely. Ah, no, of course, he would not come. Dear heaven, think of that. Never any more. And she wanted him so. And there were so many little trying things to adjust, for a change of this nature is too radical to be passed over lightly. The explanation she had to make to Vesta was of all the most important. This little girl, who was old enough now to see and think for herself, was not without her surmises and misgivings. Vesta recalled that her mother had been accused of not being married to her father when she was born. She had seen the article about Jennie and Lester in the Sunday paper at the time it had appeared. It had been shown to her at school. But she had had sense enough to say nothing about it, feeling somehow that Jennie would not like it. Lester's disappearance was a complete surprise, but she had learned in the last 2 or 3 years that her mother was very sensitive and that she could hurt her in unexpected ways. Jennie was finally compelled to tell Vesta that Lester's fortune had been dependent on his leaving her, solely because she was not of his station. Vesta listened soberly and half suspected the truth. She felt terribly sorry for her mother, and because of Jennie's obvious distress, she was trebly gay and courageous. She refused outright the suggestion of going to a boarding school, and kept as close to her mother as she could. She found interesting books to read with her, insisted that they go to see plays together, played to her on the piano, and asked for her mother's criticisms on her drawing and modeling. She found a few friends in the excellent Sandwood School and brought them home of an evening to add lightness and gaiety to the cottage life. Jennie, through her growing appreciation of Vesta's fine character, became more and more drawn toward her. Lester was gone, but at least she had Vesta. That prop would probably sustain her in the face of a waning existence. There was also her history to account for to the residents of Sandwood. In many cases, when one is content to lead a secluded life, it is not necessary to say much of one's past, but as a rule something must be said. People have the habit of inquiring if they are no more than butchers and bakers. By degrees one must account for this and that fact, and it was so here. She could not say that her husband was dead. Lester might come back. She had to say that she had left him, to give the impression that it would be she, if anyone, who would permit him to return. This put her in an interesting and sympathetic light in the neighborhood. It was the most sensible thing to do. She then settled down to a quiet routine of existence, waiting what denouement to her life she could not guess. Sandwood life was not without its charms for a lover of nature, and this, with the devotion of Vesta, offered some slight solace. There was the beauty of the lake, which, with its passing boats, was a never-ending source of joy, and there were many charming drives in the surrounding country. Jennie had her own horse and carryall, one of the horses of the pair they had used in Hyde Park. Other household pets appeared in due course of time, including a collie that Vesta named Rats. She had brought him from Chicago as a puppy, and he had grown to be a sterling watchdog, sensible and affectionate. There was also a cat, Jimmy Woods, so called after a boy Vesta knew, and to whom she insisted the cat bore a marked resemblance. There was a singing thrush, guarded carefully against the roving desire for bird food on the part of Jimmy Woods, and a jar of goldfish. So this little household drifted along quietly and dreamily indeed, but always with the undercurrent of feeling which ran so still because it was so deep. There was no word from Lester for the first few weeks following his departure. He was too busy following up the threads of his new commercial connections and too considerate to wish to keep Jennie in a state of mental turmoil over communications which, under the present circumstances, could mean nothing. He preferred to let matters rest for the time being. Then a little later he would write her sanely and calmly of how things were going. He did this after the silence of a month, saying that he had been pretty well pressed by commercial affairs, that he had been in and out of the city frequently, which was the truth, and that he would probably be away from Chicago a large part of the time in the future. He inquired after Vesta and the condition of affairs generally at Sandwood. I might get up there one of these days, he suggested, but he really did not mean to come, and Jennie knew that he did not. Another month passed, and there was a second letter from him, not so long as the first one. Jennie had written him frankly and fully, telling him just how things stood with her. She concealed entirely her own feelings in the matter, saying that she liked the life very much, and that she was glad to be at Sandwood. She expressed a hope that now everything was coming out for the best for him, and tried to show him that she was really glad matters had been settled. "You mustn't think of me as being unhappy," she said in one place, "for I am not. I am sure it ought to be just as it is, and I wouldn't be happy if it were any other way. Lay out your life so as to give yourself the greatest happiness, Lester," she added. "You deserve it. Whatever you do will be just right for me. I won't mind." She had Mrs. Gerald in mind, and he suspected as much, but he felt that her generosity must be tinged greatly with self-sacrifice and secret unhappiness. It was the one thing which made him hesitate about taking that final step. The written word and the hidden thought, how they conflict. After 6 months the correspondence was more or less perfunctory on his part, and at 8 it had ceased temporarily. One morning as she was glancing over the daily paper, she saw among the society notes the following item: "The engagement of Mrs. Malcolm Gerhardt, of 4044 Drexel Boulevard, to Lester Kane, second son of the late Archibald Kane, of Cincinnati, was formally announced at a party given by the prospective bride on Tuesday to a circle of her immediate friends. The wedding will take place in April." The paper fell from her hands. For a few minutes she sat perfectly still, looking straight ahead of her. Could this thing be so, she asked herself. Had it really come at last? She had known that it must come, and yet she had always hoped that it would not. Why had she hoped? Had not she herself sent him away? Had not she herself suggested this very thing in a roundabout way? It had come now. What must she do? Stay here as a pensioner? The idea was objectionable to her, and yet he had set aside a goodly sum to be hers absolutely. In the hands of a trust company in LaSalle Street were railway certificates aggregating $75,000, which yielded $4,500 annually, the income being paid to her direct. Could she refuse to receive this money? There was Vesta to be considered. Jennie felt hurt through and through by this denouement, and yet, as she sat there, she realized that it was foolish to be angry. Life was always doing this sort of thing to her. It would go on doing so. She was sure of it. If she went out in the world and earned her own living, what difference would it make to him? What difference would it make to Mrs. Gerald? Here she was walled in this little place, leading an obscure existence, and there he was out in the great world, enjoying life in its fullest and freest sense. It was too bad, but why cry? Why? Her eyes indeed were dry, but her very soul seemed to be torn in pieces within her. She rose carefully, hid the newspaper at the bottom of a trunk, and turned the key upon it. End of chapter 57. Chapter 58 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Now that his engagement to Mrs. Gerald was an accomplished fact, Lester found no particular difficulty in reconciling himself to the new order of things. Undoubtedly, it was all for the best. He was sorry for Jennie, very sorry. So was Mrs. Gerald. But there was a practical unguent to her grief in the thought that it was best for both Lester and the girl. He would be happier, was so now, and Jennie would eventually realize that she had done a wise and kindly thing. She would be glad in the consciousness that she had acted so unselfishly. As for Mrs. Gerald, because of her indifference to the late Malcolm Gerald, and because she was realizing the dreams of her youth in getting Lester at last, even though a little late, she was intensely happy. She could think of nothing finer than this daily life with him, the places they would go, the things they would see. Her first season in Chicago as Mrs. Lester Kane the following winter was going to be something worth remembering. And as for Japan, that was almost too good to be true. Lester wrote to Jennie of his coming marriage to Mrs. Gerald. He said that he had no explanation to make. It wouldn't be worth anything if he did make it. He thought he ought to marry Mrs. Gerald. He thought he ought to let her, Jennie, know. He hoped she was well. He wanted her always to feel that he had her real interests at heart. He would do anything in his power to make life as pleasant and agreeable for her as possible. He hoped she would forgive him. And would she remember him affectionately to Vesta? She ought to be sent to a finishing school. Jennie understood the situation perfectly. She knew that Lester had been drawn to Mrs. Gerald from the time he met her at the Carlton in London. She had been angling for him. Now she had him. It was all right. She hoped he would be happy. She was glad to write and tell him so, explaining that she had seen the announcement in the paper. Lester read her letter thoughtfully. There was more between the lines than the written words conveyed. Her fortitude was a charm to him even in this hour. In spite of all he had done and what he was now going to do, he realized that he still cared for Jennie in a way. She was a noble and a charming woman. If everything else had been all right, he would not be going to marry Mrs. Gerald at all. And yet he did marry her. The ceremony was performed on April 15th at the residence of Mrs. Gerald, a Roman Catholic priest officiating. Lester was a poor example of the faith he occasionally professed. He was an agnostic, but because he had been reared in the church, he felt that he might as well be married in it. Some 50 guests, intimate friends, had been invited. The ceremony went off with perfect smoothness. There were jubilant congratulations and showers of rice and confetti. While the guests were still eating and drinking, Lester and Letty managed to escape by a side entrance into a closed carriage and were off. 15 minutes later there was pursuit pell-mell on the part of the guests to the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Depot. But by that time the happy couple were in their private car, and the arrival of the rice throwers made no difference. More champagne was opened. Then the starting of the train ended all excitement, and the newly wedded pair were at last safely off. "Well, now you have me," said Lester cheerfully, pulling Letty down beside him into a seat. "What of it?" "This of it," she exclaimed, and hugged him close, kissing him fervently. In 4 days they were in San Francisco, and 2 days later on board a fast steamship bound for the land of the Mikado. In the meanwhile Jennie was left to brood. The original announcement in the newspaper had said that he was to be married in April, and she had kept close watch for additional information. Finally she learned that the wedding would take place on April 15th at the residence of the prospective bride, the hour being high noon. In spite of her feeling of resignation, Jennie followed it all hopelessly, like a child, hungry and forlorn, looking into a lighted window at Christmas time. On the day of the wedding She waited miserably for 12 o'clock to strike. It seemed as though she were really present and looking on. She could see in her mind's eye the handsome residence, the carriages, the guests, the feast, the merriment, the ceremony, all. Telepathically and psychologically she received impressions of the private car and the joyous journey they were going to take. The papers had stated that they would spend their honeymoon in Japan. Their honeymoon! Her Lester! And Mrs. Gerald was so attractive. She could see her now, the new Mrs. Kane, the only Mrs. Kane that ever was, lying in his arms. He had held her so once. He had loved her. Yes, he had. There was a solid lump in her throat as she thought of this. Oh dear, she sighed to herself and clasped her hands forcefully. But it did no good. She was just as miserable as before. When the day was over, she was actually relieved. Anyway, the deed was done and nothing could change it. Vesta was sympathetically aware of what was happening, but kept silent. She too had seen the report in the newspaper. When the first and second day after it passed, Jennie was much calmer mentally, for now she was face to face with the inevitable. But it was weeks before the sharp pain dulled to the old familiar ache. Then there were months before they would be back again, though of course that made no difference now. Only Japan seemed so far off, and somehow she liked the thought that Lester was near her, somewhere in the city. The spring and summer passed, and now it was early October. One chilly day Vesta came home from school complaining of a headache. When Jennie had given her hot milk, a favorite remedy of her mother's, and had advised a cold towel for the back of her head, Vesta went to her room and lay down. The following morning she had a slight fever. This lingered while the local physician, Dr. Emery, treated her tentatively, suspecting that it might be typhoid, of which there were several cases in the village. This doctor told Jennie that Vesta was probably strong enough constitutionally to shake it off, but it might be that she would have a severe siege. Mistrusting her own skill in so delicate a situation, Jennie sent to Chicago for a trained nurse, and then began a period of watchfulness, which was a combination of fear, longing, hope, and courage. Now there could be no doubt. The disease was typhoid. Jennie hesitated about communicating with Lester, who was supposed to be in New York. The papers had said that he intended to spend the winter there. But when the doctor, after watching the case for a week, pronounced it severe, she thought she ought to write anyhow, for no one could tell what would happen. Lester had been so fond of Vesta, he would probably want to know. The letter sent to him did not reach him, for at the time it arrived he was on his way to the West Indies. Jennie was compelled to watch alone by Vesta's sick bed, for although sympathetic neighbors, realizing the pathos of the situation, were attentive, they could not supply the spiritual consolation which only those who truly love us can give. There was a period when Vesta appeared to be rallying, and both the physician and the nurse were hopeful. But afterward she became weaker. It was said by Dr. Emery that her heart and kidneys had become affected. There came a time when the fact had to be faced that death was imminent. The doctor's face was grave. The nurse was non-committal in her opinion. Jennie hovered about, praying the only prayer that is a prayer, the fervent desire of her heart concentrated on the one issue, that Vesta should get well. The child had come so close to her during the last few years. She understood her mother. She was beginning to realize clearly what her life had been. And Jennie, through her, had grown to a broad understanding of responsibility. She knew now what it meant to be a good mother and to have children. If Lester had not objected to it, and she had been truly married, she would have been glad to have others. Again, she had always felt that she owed Vesta so much, at least a long and happy life, to make up to her for the ignominy of her birth and rearing. Jennie had been so happy during the past few years to see Vesta growing into beautiful, graceful, intelligent womanhood. And now she was dying. Dr. Emory finally sent to Chicago for a physician friend of his who came to consider the case with him. He was an old man, grave, sympathetic, and understanding. He shook his head. "The treatment has been correct," he said. "Her system does not appear to be strong enough to endure the strain. Some physiques are more susceptible to this malady than others." It was agreed that if within 3 days a change for the better did not come, the end was close at hand. No one can conceive the strain to which Jennie's spirit was subjected by this intelligence, for it was deemed best that she should know. She hovered about, white-faced, feeling intensely but scarcely thinking. She seemed to vibrate consciously with Vesta's altering states. If there was the least improvement, she felt it physically. If there was a decline, her barometric temperament registered the fact. There was a Mrs. Davis, a fine, motherly soul of 50, stout and sympathetic, who lived 4 doors from Jennie, and who understood quite well how she was feeling. She had cooperated with the nurse and the doctor from the start to keep Jennie's mental state as nearly normal as possible. "Now, you just go to your room and lie down, Mrs. Kane," she would say to Jennie when she found her watching helplessly at the bedside or wandering to and fro, wondering what to do. "I'll take charge of everything. I'll do what you would do. Lord bless you, don't you think I know? I've been the mother of 7 and lost 3. Don't you think I understand?" Jennie put her head on her big, warm shoulder one day and cried. Mrs. Davis cried with her. "I understand," she said. "There, there, you poor dear. Now you come with me." And she led her to her sleeping room. Jennie could not be away long. She came back after a few minutes unrested and unrefreshed. Finally, one midnight, when the nurse had persuaded her that all would be well until morning anyhow, there came a hurried stirring in the sick room. Jennie was lying down for a few minutes on her bed in the adjoining room. She heard it and arose. Mrs. Davis had come in, and she and the nurse were conferring as to Vesta's condition, standing close beside her. Jennie understood. She came up and looked at her daughter keenly. Vesta's pale waxen face told the story. She was breathing faintly, her eyes closed. "She's very weak," whispered the nurse. Mrs. Davis took Jennie's hand. The moments passed, and after a time the clock in the hall struck 1. Miss Murphy, the nurse, moved to the medicine table several times, wetting a soft piece of cotton cloth with alcohol and bathing Vesta's lips. At the striking of the half hour, there was a stir of the weak body, a profound sigh. Jennie bent forward eagerly, but Mrs. Davis drew her back. The nurse came and motioned them away. Respiration had ceased. Mrs. Davis seized Jennie firmly. "There, there, you poor dear," she whispered when she began to shake. "It can't be helped. Don't cry." Jennie sank on her knees beside the bed and caressed Vesta's still, warm hand. "Oh no, Vesta," she pleaded. "Not you, not you." "There, dear. Come now," soothed the voice of Mrs. Davis. "Can't you leave it all in God's hands? Can't you believe that everything is for the best?" Jennie felt as if the earth had fallen. All ties were broken. There was no light anywhere in the immense darkness of her existence. End of chapter 58. Chapter 59 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. This added blow from inconsiderate fortune was quite enough to throw Jennie back into that state of hypermelancholia from which she had been drawn with difficulty during the few years of comfort and affection which she had enjoyed with Lester in Hyde Park. It was really weeks before she could realize that Vesta was gone. The emaciated figure which she saw for a day or two after the end did not seem like Vesta. Where was the joy, the lightness, the quickness of motion, the subtle radiance of health? All gone. Only this pale, lily-hued shell and silence. Jennie had no tears to shed, only a deep, insistent pain to feel. If only some counselor of eternal wisdom could have whispered to her that obvious and convincing truth, there are no dead. Mrs. Murphy, Dr. Emery, Mrs. Davis, and some others among the neighbors were most sympathetic and considerate. Mrs. Davis sent a telegram to Lester saying that Vesta was dead, but being absent, there was no response. The house was looked after with scrupulous care by others, for Jennie was incapable of attending to it herself. She walked about looking at things which Vesta had owned or liked, things which Lester or she had given her, sighing over the fact that Vesta would not need or use them any more. She gave instructions that the body should be taken to Chicago and buried in the cemetery of the Redeemer, for Lester, at the time of Gerhardt's death, had purchased a small plot of ground there. She also expressed her wish that the minister of the little Lutheran church in Cottage Grove Avenue, where Gerhardt had attended, should be requested to say a few words at the grave. There were the usual preliminary services at the house. The local Methodist minister read a portion of the first epistle of Paul to the Thessalonians, and a body of Vesta's classmates sang, "Nearer, my God, to Thee." There were flowers, a white coffin, a world of sympathetic expressions, and then Vesta was taken away. The coffin was properly encased for transportation, put on the train, and finally delivered at the Lutheran cemetery in Chicago. Jennie moved as one in a dream. She was dazed, almost to the point of insensibility. 5 of her neighbor friends, at the solicitation of Mrs. Davis, were kind enough to accompany her. At the gravesite, when the body was finally lowered, she looked at it. One might have thought indifferently, for she was numb from suffering. She returned to Sandwood after it was all over, saying that she would not stay long. She wanted to come back to Chicago, where she could be near Vesta and Gerhardt. After the funeral, Jennie tried to think of her future. She fixed her mind on the need of doing something, even though she did not need to. She thought that she might like to try nursing, and could start at once to obtain the training which was required. She also thought of William. He was unmarried, and perhaps he might be willing to come and live with her. Only she did not know where he was, and Bass was also in ignorance of his whereabouts. She finally concluded that she would try to get work in a store. Her disposition was against idleness. She could not live alone here, and she could not have her neighbors sympathetically worrying over what was to become of her. Miserable as she was, she would be less miserable stopping in a hotel in Chicago and looking for something to do, or living in a cottage somewhere near the cemetery of the Redeemer. It also occurred to her that she might adopt a homeless child. There were a number of orphan asylums in the city. Some 3 weeks after Vesta's death, Lester returned to Chicago with his wife and discovered the first letter, the telegram, and an additional note telling him that Vesta was dead. He was truly grieved, for his affection for the girl had been real. He was very sorry for Jennie, and he told his wife that he would have to go out and see her. He was wondering what she would do. She could not live alone. Perhaps he could suggest something which would help her. He took the train to Sandwood, but Jennie had gone to the Hotel Tremont in Chicago. He went there, but Jennie had gone to her daughter's grave. Later he called again and found her in. When the boy presented his card, she suffered an upwelling of feeling, a wave that was more intense than that with which she had received him in the olden days, for now her need of him was greater. Lester, in spite of the glamour of his new affection and the restoration of his wealth, power, and dignities, had had time to think deeply of what he had done. His original feeling of doubt and dissatisfaction with himself had never wholly quieted. It did not ease him any to know that he had left Jennie comfortably fixed, for it was always so plain to him that money was not the point at issue with her. Affection was what she craved. Without it, she was like a rudderless boat on an endless sea, and he knew it. She needed him, and he was ashamed to think that his charity had not outweighed his sense of self-preservation and his desire for material advantage. Today, as the elevator carried him up to her room, he was really sorry, though he knew now that no act of his could make things right. He had been to blame from the very beginning, first for taking her, then for failing to stick by a bad bargain. Well, it could not be helped now. The best thing he could do was to be fair, to counsel with her, to give her the best of his sympathy and advice. "Hello, Jennie," he said familiarly, as she opened the door to him in her hotel room, his glance taking in the ravages which death and suffering had wrought. She was thinner, her face quite drawn and colorless, her eyes larger by contrast. "I'm awfully sorry about Vesta," he said a little awkwardly. "I never dreamed anything like that could happen." It was the first word of comfort which had meant anything to her since Vesta died, since Lester had left her, in fact. It touched her that he had come to sympathize. For the moment she could not speak. Tears welled over her eyelids and down upon her cheeks. "Don't cry, Jennie," he said, putting his arm around her and holding her head to his shoulder. "I'm sorry. I've been sorry for a good many things that can't be helped now. I'm intensely sorry for this. Where did you bury her?" "Beside Papa," she said, sobbing. "Too bad," he murmured, and held her in silence. She finally gained control of herself sufficiently to step away from him. Then, wiping her eyes with her handkerchief, she asked him to sit down. "I'm so sorry," he went on, "that this should have happened while I was away. I would have been with you if I had been here. I suppose you won't want to live out at Sandwood now." "I can't, Lester," she replied. "I couldn't stand it." "Where are you thinking of going?" "Oh, I don't know yet. I didn't want to be a bother to those people out there. I thought I'd get a little house somewhere and adopt a baby maybe, or get something to do. I don't like to be alone." "That isn't a bad idea," he said, "that of adopting a baby. It would be a lot of company for you. You know how to go about getting one?" "You just ask at one of these asylums, don't you?" "I think there's something more than that," he replied thoughtfully. "There are some formalities. I don't know what they are. They try to keep control of the child in some way. You had better consult with Watson and get him to help you. Pick out your baby and then let him do the rest. I'll speak to him about it." Lester saw that she needed companionship badly. "Where's your brother George?" he asked. "He's in Rochester, but he couldn't come. Bass said he was married," she added. "There isn't any other member of the family you could persuade to come and live with you?" "I might get William, but I don't know where he is." "Why not try that new section west of Jackson Park," he suggested, "if you want a house here in Chicago. I see some nice cottages out that way. You needn't buy, just rent until you see how well you are satisfied." Jennie thought this good advice because it came from Lester. It was good of him to take this much interest in her affairs. She wasn't entirely separated from him, after all. He cared a little. She asked him how his wife was, whether he had had a pleasant trip, and whether he was going to stay in Chicago. All the while he was thinking that he had treated her badly. He went to the window and looked down into Dearborn Street, the world of traffic below holding his attention. The great mass of trucks and vehicles, The counter streams of hurrying pedestrians seemed like a puzzle. So shadows march in a dream. It was growing dusk, and lights were springing up here and there. "I want to tell you something, Jennie," Lester said, finally rousing himself from his fit of abstraction. "I may seem peculiar to you, after all that has happened, but I still care for you in my way. I thought of you right along since I left. I thought it good business to leave you, the way things were. I thought I liked Letty well enough to marry her. From one point of view, it still seems best, but I'm not so much happier. I was just as happy with you as I ever will be. It isn't myself that's important in this transaction, apparently. The individual doesn't count so much in the situation. I don't know whether you see what I'm driving at, but all of us are more or less pawns. We're moved about like chessmen by circumstances over which we have no control." "I understand, Lester," she answered. "I'm not complaining. I know it's for the best." "After all, life is more or less a farce," he went on, a little bitterly. "It's a silly show. The best we can do is to hold our personality intact. It doesn't appear that integrity has much to do with it." Jennie did not quite grasp what he was talking about, but she knew it meant that he was not entirely satisfied with himself and was sorry for her. "Don't worry over me, Lester," she counseled. "I'm all right. I'll get along. It did seem terrible to me for a while, getting used to being alone. I'll be all right now. I'll get along." "I want you to feel that my attitude hasn't changed," he continued eagerly. "I'm interested in what concerns you. Mrs. Letty understands that. She knows just how I feel. When you get settled, I'll come in and see how you're fixed. I'll come around here again in a few days. You understand how I feel, don't you?" "Yes, I do," she said. He took her hand, turning it sympathetically in his own. "Don't worry," he said. "I don't want you to do that. I'll do the best I can. You're still Jennie to me, if you don't mind. I'm pretty bad, but I'm not all bad." "It's all right, Lester. I wanted you to do as you did. It's for the best. You probably are happy since—" "Now, Jennie," he interrupted. Then he pressed affectionately her hand, her arm, her shoulder. "Want to kiss me for old time's sake?" he smiled. She put her hands over his shoulders, looking long into his eyes, then kissed him. When their lips met she trembled. Lester also felt unsteady. Jennie saw his agitation and tried hard to speak. "You'd better go now," she said firmly. "It's getting dark." He went away, and yet he knew that he wanted above all things to remain. She was still the one woman in the world for him, and Jennie felt comforted, even though the separation still existed in all its finality. She did not endeavor to explain or adjust the moral and ethical entanglements of the situation. She was not, like so many, endeavoring to put the ocean into a teacup, or tie up the shifting universe in a mess of string called law. Lester still cared for her a little. He cared for Letty, too. That was all right. She had once hoped that he might want her only. Since he did not, was his affection worth nothing? She could not think, she could not feel that, and neither could he. End of chapter 59. Chapter 60 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The drift of events for a period of 5 years carried Lester and Jennie still farther apart. They settled naturally into their respective spheres, without the renewal of the old-time relationship which their several meetings at the Tremont at first seemed to foreshadow. Lester was in the thick of social and commercial affairs. He walked in paths to which Jennie's retiring soul had never aspired. Jennie's own existence was quiet and uneventful. There was a simple cottage in a very respectable but not showy neighborhood near Jackson Park on the South Side, where she lived in retirement with a little foster child, a chestnut-haired girl taken from the Western homes for the friendless, as her sole companion. Here she was known as Mrs. J. G. Stover, for she had deemed it best to abandon the name of Kane. Mr. and Mrs. Lester Kane, when resident in Chicago, were the occupants of a handsome mansion on the Lakeshore Drive, where parties, balls, receptions, dinners were given in rapid and at times almost pyrotechnic succession. Lester, however, had become in his way a lover of a peaceful and well-entertained existence. He had cut from his list of acquaintances and associates a number of people who had been a little doubtful or overfamiliar or indifferent or talkative during a certain period which to him was a memory merely. He was a director, and in several cases the chairman of a board of directors in 9 of the most important financial and commercial organizations of the West: the United Traction Company of Cincinnati, the Western Crucible Company, the United Carriage Company, the Second National Bank of Chicago, the First National Bank of Cincinnati, and several others of equal importance. He was never a personal factor in the affairs of the United Carriage Company, preferring to be represented by counsel, Mr. Dwight L. Watson, but he took a keen interest in its affairs. He had not seen his brother Robert to speak to him in 7 years. He had not seen Imogene, who lived in Chicago, in 3. Louise, Amy, their husbands, and some of their closest acquaintances were practically strangers. The firm of Knight, Keatley, and O'Brien had nothing whatever to do with his affairs. The truth was that Lester, in addition to becoming a little phlegmatic, was becoming decidedly critical in his outlook on life. He could not make out what it was all about. In distant ages a queer thing had come to pass. There had started on its way in the form of evolution a minute cellular organism which had apparently reproduced itself by division, and had early learned to combine itself with others, to organize itself into bodies, strange forms of fish, animals, and birds, and had finally learned to organize itself into man. Man, on his part, composed as he was of self-organizing cells, was pushing himself forward into comfort and different aspects of existence by means of union and organization with other men. Why? Heaven only knew. Here he was endowed with a peculiar brain and a certain amount of talent, and he had inherited a certain amount of wealth which he now scarcely believed he deserved. Only luck had favored him. But he could not see that anyone else might be said to deserve this wealth any more than himself. Seeing that his use of it was as conservative and constructive and practical as the next one's. He might have been born poor, in which case he would have been as well satisfied as the next one, not more so. Why should he complain? Why worry? Why speculate? The world was going steadily forward of its own volition, whether he would or not. Truly it was. And was there any need for him to disturb himself about it? There was not. He fancied at times that it might as well have never been started at all. The one divine, far-off event of the poet did not appeal to him as having any basis in fact. Mrs. Lester Kane was of very much the same opinion. Jennie, living on the South Side with her adopted child, Rose Perpetua, was of no fixed conclusions as to the meaning of life. She had not the incisive reasoning capacity of either Mr. or Mrs. Lester Kane. She had seen a great deal, suffered a great deal, and had read in some desultory way. Her mind had never grasped the nature and character of specialized knowledge. History, physics, chemistry, botany, geology, and sociology were not fixed departments in her brain as they were in Lester and Letty's. Instead, there was the feeling that the world moved in some strange, unstable way. Apparently, No one knew clearly what it was all about. People were born and died. Some believed that the world had been made 6,000 years before, some that it was millions of years old. Was it all blind chance, or was there some guiding intelligence, a God? Almost in spite of herself, she felt that there must be something, a higher power which produced all the beautiful things, the flowers, the stars, the trees, the grass. Nature was so beautiful. If at times life seemed cruel, yet this beauty still persisted. The thought comforted her. She fed upon it in her hours of secret loneliness. It has been said that Jennie was naturally of an industrious turn. She liked to be employed, though she thought constantly as she worked. She was of matronly proportions in these days, not disagreeably large, but full-bodied, shapely, and smooth-faced in spite of her cares. Her eyes were gray and appealing. Her hair was still of a rich brown, but there were traces of gray in it. Her neighbors spoke of her as sweet-tempered, kindly, and hospitable. They knew nothing of her history, except that she had formerly resided in Sandwood, and before that in Cleveland. She was very reticent as to her past. Jennie had fancied, because of her natural aptitude for taking care of sick people, that she might get to be a trained nurse, but she was obliged to abandon that idea, for she found that only young people were wanted. She also thought that some charitable organization might employ her, but she did not understand the new theory of charity, which was then coming into general acceptance and practice, namely, only to help others to help themselves. She believed in giving, and was not inclined to look too closely into the credentials of those who asked for help. Consequently, her timid inquiry at one relief agency after another met with indifference, if not unqualified rebuke. She finally decided to adopt another child for Rose Perpetua's sake. She succeeded in securing a boy, 4 years old, who was known as Henry Stover. Her support was assured, for her income was paid to her through a trust company. She had no desire for speculation or for the devious ways of trade. The care of flowers, the nature of children, the ordering of a home, were more in her province. One of the interesting things in connection with this separation, once it had been firmly established, related to Robert and Lester. For these two, since the reading of the will a number of years before, had never met. Robert had thought of his brother often. He had followed his success since he had left Jennie with interest. He read of his marriage to Mrs. Gerald with pleasure. He had always considered her an ideal companion for his brother. He knew by many signs and tokens that his brother, since the unfortunate termination of their father's attitude and his own peculiar movements to gain control of the Kane Company, did not like him. Still, they had never been so far apart mentally, certainly not in commercial judgment. Lester was prosperous now. He could afford to be generous. He could afford to make up. And after all, he had done his best to aid his brother to come to his senses, and with the best intentions. There were mutual interests they could share financially if they were friends. He wondered from time to time if Lester would not be friendly with him. Time passed, and then once, when he was in Chicago, he made the friends with whom he was driving purposely turn into the North Shore in order to see the splendid mansion which the Kanes occupied. He knew its location from hearsay and description. When he saw it, a touch of the old Kane home atmosphere came back to him. Lester, in revising the property after purchase, had had a conservatory built on one side not unlike the one at home in Cincinnati. The same night he sat down and wrote Lester asking if he would not like to dine with him at the Union Club. He was in town only for a day or two, and he would like to see him again. There was some feeling, he knew, but there was a proposition that he would like to talk to him about. Would he come, say on Thursday? On receipt of this letter, Lester frowned, and fell into a brown study. He had never really been healed of the wound that his father had given him. He had never been comfortable in his mind since Robert had deserted him so summarily. He realized now that the stakes his brother had been playing for were big. But after all, he had been his brother, and if he had been in Robert's place at the time, he would not have done as he had done. At least he hoped not. Now Robert wanted to see him. He thought once of not answering at all. Then he thought he would write and say no. But a curious desire to see Robert again, to hear what he had to say, to listen to the proposition he had to offer, came over him. He decided to write yes. It could do no harm. He knew it could do no good. They might agree to let bygones be bygones, but the damage had been done. Could a broken bowl be mended and called whole? It might be called whole, but what of it? Was it not broken and mended? He wrote and intimated that he would come. On the Thursday in question, Robert called up from the auditorium to remind him of the engagement. Lester listened curiously to the sound of his voice. "All right," he said. "I'll be with you." At noon he went downtown, and there, within the exclusive precincts of the Union Club, the two brothers met and looked at each other again. Robert was thinner than when Lester had seen him last, and a little grayer. His eyes were bright and steely, but there were crow's feet on either side. His manner was quick, keen, dynamic. Lester was noticeably of another type, solid, brusque, and indifferent. Men spoke of Lester these days as a little hard. Robert's keen blue eyes did not disturb him in the least, did not affect him in any way. He saw his brother just as he was, for he had the larger philosophic and interpretive insight. But Robert could not place Lester exactly. He could not fathom just what had happened to him in these years. Lester was stouter, not gray, for some reason, but sandy and ruddy, looking like a man who was fairly well satisfied to take life as he found it. Lester looked at his brother with a keen, steady eye. The latter shifted a little, for he was restless. He could see that there was no loss of the mental force and courage which had always been predominant characteristics in Lester's make-up. "I thought I'd like to see you again, Lester," Robert remarked, after they had clasped hands in the customary grip. "It's been a long time now. Nearly 8 years, hasn't it?" "About that," replied Lester. "How are things with you?" "Oh, about the same. You've been fairly well, I see." "Never sick," said Lester. "A little cold now and then. I don't often go to bed with anything. How's your wife?" "Oh, Margaret's fine." "And the children?" "We don't see much of Ralph and Bernice since they married, but the others are around more or less. I suppose your wife is all right," he said hesitatingly. It was difficult ground for Robert. Lester eyed him without a change of expression. "Yes," he replied. "She enjoys pretty fair health. She's quite well at present." They drifted mentally for a few moments, while Lester inquired after the business and Amy, Louise, and Imogene. He admitted frankly that he neither saw nor heard from them nowadays. Robert told him what he could. "The thing that I was thinking of in connection with you, Lester," said Robert finally, "is this matter of the Western Crucible Steel Company. You haven't been sitting there as a director in person, I noticed, but your attorney, Watson, has been acting for you. Clever man, that. The management isn't right. We all know that. We need a practical steel man at the head of it, if the thing is ever going to pay properly. I have voted my stock with yours right along, because the propositions made by Watson have been right. He agrees with me that things ought to be changed. Now I have a chance to buy 70 shares held by Rossiter's widow. That, with yours and mine, would give us control of the company. I would like to have you take them, though it doesn't make a bit of difference so long as it's in the family. You can put anyone you please in for president, and we'll make the thing come out right." Lester smiled. It was a pleasant proposition. Watson had told him that Robert's interests were cooperating with him. Lester had long suspected that Robert would like to make up. This was the olive branch, the control of a property worth in the neighborhood of $1.5 million. "That's very nice of you," said Lester solemnly. "It's a rather liberal thing to do. What makes you want to do it now?" "Well, to tell you the honest truth, Lester," replied Robert, "I never did feel right about that will business. I never did feel right about that secretary-treasurership and some other things that have happened. I don't want to rake up the past. You smile at that, but I can't help telling you how I feel. I've been pretty ambitious in the past. I was pretty ambitious just about the time Father died to get this United Carriage scheme under way, and I was afraid you might not like it. I have thought since that I ought not to have done it, but I did. I suppose you're not anxious to hear any more about that old affair. This other thing, though—" "Might be handed out as a sort of compensation," put in Lester quietly. "Not exactly that, Lester, though it may have something of that in it. I know these things don't matter very much to you. I know that the time to do things was years ago, not now. I thought sincerely that you might be interested in this proposition. It might lead to other things. Frankly, I thought it might patch up matters between us. We're brothers, after all." "Yes," said Lester, "we're brothers." He was thinking as he said this of the irony of the situation. How much had this sense of brotherhood been worth in the past? Robert had practically forced him into his present relationship, and while Jennie had been really the only one to suffer, he could not help feeling angry. It was true that Robert had not cut him out of his 1/4 of his father's estate, but certainly he had not helped him to get it. And now Robert was thinking that this offer of his might mend things. It hurt him, Lester, a little. It irritated him. Life was strange. "I can't see it, Robert," he said finally and determinedly. "I can appreciate the motive that prompts you to make this offer, but I can't see the wisdom of my taking it. Your opportunity is your opportunity. I don't want it. We can make all the changes you suggest if you take the stock. I'm rich enough anyhow. Bygones are bygones. I'm perfectly willing to talk with you from time to time. That's all you want. This other thing is simply a sop with which to plaster an old wound. You want my friendship, and so far as I'm concerned, you have that. I don't hold any grudge against you. I won't." Robert looked at him fixedly. He half smiled. He admired Lester in spite of all that had been done to him, in spite of all that Lester was doing to him now. "I don't know but you're right, Lester," he admitted finally. "I didn't make this offer in any petty spirit, though. I wanted to patch up this matter of feeling between us. I won't say anything more about it. You're not coming down to Cincinnati soon, are you?" "I don't expect to," replied Lester. "If you do, I'd like to have you come and stay with us. Bring your wife. We could talk over old times." Lester smiled an enigmatic smile. "I'll be glad to," he said without emotion. But he remembered that in the days of Jennie it was different. They would never have receded from their position regarding her. "Well," he thought, "perhaps I can't blame them. Let it go." They talked on about other things. Finally Lester remembered an appointment. "I'll have to leave you soon," he said, looking at his watch. "I ought to go too," said Robert. They rose. "Well, anyhow," he added, as they walked toward the cloakroom, "we won't be absolute strangers in the future, will we?" "Certainly not," said Lester. "I'll see you from time to time." They shook hands and separated amicably. There was a sense of unsatisfied obligation and some remorse in Robert's mind as he saw his brother walking briskly away. Lester was an able man. Why was it that there was so much feeling between them? Had been even before Jennie had appeared. Then he remembered his old thoughts about snaky deeds. That was what his brother lacked, and that only. He was not crafty, not darkly cruel, hence, what a world, he thought. On his part, Lester went away feeling a slight sense of opposition to, but also of sympathy for his brother. He was not so terribly bad, not different from other men. Why criticize? What would he have done if he had been in Robert's place? Robert was getting along. So was he. He could see now how it all came about, why he had been made the victim, why his brother had been made the keeper of the great fortune. It's the way the world runs, he thought. What difference does it make? I have enough to live on. Why not let it go at that? End of chapter 60. Chapter 61 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The days of man under the old dispensation, or rather, according to that supposedly biblical formula which persists, are 80 years and 10. It is so imagined in the race consciousness by mouth-to-mouth utterance that it seems the profoundest of truths. As a matter of fact, man, even under his mortal illusion, is organically built to live 5 times the period of his maturity, and would do so if he but knew that it is spirit which endures, that age is an illusion, and that there is no death. Yet race thought, gained from what dreams of materialism we know not, persists, and the death of man, under the mathematical formula so fearfully accepted, is daily registered. Lester was one of those who believed in this formula. He was nearing 60. He thought he had, say, 20 more years at the utmost to live, perhaps not so long. Well, he had lived comfortably. He felt that he could not complain. If death was coming, let it come. He was ready at any time. No complaint or resistance would issue from him. Life, in most of its aspects, was a silly show, anyhow. He admitted that it was mostly illusion, easily proved to be so. That it all may be one he sometimes suspected. It was very much like a dream in its composition, truly, sometimes like a very bad dream. All he had to sustain him in his acceptance of its reality from hour to hour and day to day was apparent contact with this material proposition and that, people, meetings of boards of directors, individuals and organizations planning to do this and that, his wife's social functions. Letty loved him as a fine, grizzled example of a philosopher. She admired, as Jennie had, his solid, determined, phlegmatic attitude in the face of troubled circumstances. All the winds of fortune or misfortune could not apparently excite or disturb Lester. He refused to be frightened. He refused to budge from his beliefs and feelings, and usually had to be pushed away from them, still believing, if he were gotten away at all. He refused to do anything save, as he always said, look the facts in the face and fight. He could be made to fight easily enough if imposed upon, but only in a stubborn, resisting way. His plan was to resist every effort to coerce him to the last ditch. If he had to let go in the end, he would when compelled, but his views as to the value of not letting go were quite the same even when he had let go under compulsion. His views of living were still decidedly material, grounded in creature comforts, and he had always insisted upon having the best of everything. If the furnishings of his home became the least dingy, he was for having them torn out and sold, and the house done over. If he traveled, money must go ahead of him and smooth the way. He did not want argument, useless talk, or silly palaver, as he called it. Everyone must discuss interesting topics with him, or not talk at all. Letty understood him thoroughly. She would chuck him under the chin mornings, or shake his solid head between her hands, telling him he was a brute, but a nice kind of brute. Yes, yes, he would growl, I know. I'm an animal, I suppose. You're a seraphic suggestion of attenuated thought." "No, you hush," she would reply, for at times he could cut like a knife without really meaning to be unkind. Then he would pet her a little, for in spite of her vigorous conception of life he realized that she was more or less dependent upon him. It was always so plain to her that he could get along without her. For reasons of kindliness he was trying to conceal this, to pretend the necessity of her presence, but it was so obvious that he really could dispense with her easily enough. Now Letty did depend upon Lester. It was something, in so shifty and uncertain a world, to be near so fixed and determined a quantity as this bear man. It was like being close to a warmly glowing lamp in the dark, or a bright burning fire in the cold. Lester was not afraid of anything. He felt that he knew how to live and to die. It was that a natural temperament of this kind should have its solid material manifestation at every point. Having his financial affairs well in hand, most of his holdings being shares of big companies, where boards of solemn directors merely approved the strenuous efforts of ambitious executives to make good, he had leisure for living. He and Letty were fond of visiting the various American and European watering places. He gambled a little, for he found that there was considerable diversion in risking interesting sums on the spin of a wheel or the fortuitous roll of a ball. And he took more and more to drinking, not in the sense that a drunkard takes to it, but as a high liver, socially, and with all his friends. He was inclined to drink the rich drinks when he did not take straight whiskey, champagne, sparkling Burgundy, the expenses and effervescent white wines. When he drank, he could drink a great deal, and he ate in proportion. Nothing must be served but the best: soup, fish, entree, roast, game, dessert, everything that made up a showy dinner, and he had long since determined that only a high-priced chef was worth while. They had found an old cordon bleu, Louis Bordeaux, who had served in the house of one of the great dry goods princes, and this man he engaged. He cost Lester $100 a week, but his reply to any question was that he only had one life to live. The trouble with this attitude was that it adjusted nothing, improved nothing, left everything to drift on toward an indefinite end. If Lester had married Jennie and accepted the comparatively meager income of $10,000 a year, he would have maintained the same attitude to the end. It would have led him to a stolid indifference to the social world, of which now, necessarily, he was a part. He would have drifted on with a few mentally compatible cronies who would have accepted him for what he was, a good fellow, and Jennie, in the end, would not have been so much better off than she was now. One of the changes which was interesting was that the Kanes transferred their residence to New York. Mrs. Kane had become very intimate with a group of clever women in the East 400 or 900, and had been advised and urged to transfer the scene of her activities to New York. She finally did so, leasing a house in 78th Street near Madison Avenue. She installed a novelty for her, a complete staff of liveried servants after the English fashion, and had the rooms of her house done in correlative periods. Lester smiled at her vanity and love of show. "You talk about your democracy," he grunted one day. "You have as much democracy as I have religion, and that's none at all." "Why, how you talk," she denied. "I am democratic. We all run in classes. You do. I'm merely accepting the logic of the situation." "The logic of your grandmother. Do you call a butler and doorman in red velvet a part of the necessity of the occasion?" "I certainly do," she replied. "Maybe not the necessity exactly, but the spirit, surely. Why should you quarrel? You're the first one to insist on perfection, to quarrel if there is any flaw in the order of things." "You never heard me quarrel." "Oh, I don't mean that literally, but you demand perfection the exact spirit of the occasion, and you know it." "Maybe I do. But what has that to do with your democracy?" "I am democratic. I insist on it. I am as democratic in spirit as any woman. Only I see things as they are and conform as much as possible for comfort's sake, and so do you. Don't you throw rocks at my glass house, Mr. Master. Yours is so transparent I can see every move you make inside." "I'm democratic and you're not," he teased. But he approved thoroughly of everything she did. She was, he sometimes fancied, a better executive in her world than he was in his. Drifting in this fashion, wining, dining, drinking the waters of this curative spring and that, traveling in luxurious ease, and taking no physical exercise, finally altered his body from a vigorous, quick-moving, well-balanced organism into one where a plethora of substance was clogging every essential function. His liver, kidneys, spleen, pancreas, every organ, in fact, had been overtaxed for some time to keep up the process of digestion and elimination. In the past 7 years he had become uncomfortably heavy. His kidneys were weak, and so were the arteries of his brain. By dieting, proper exercise, the right mental attitude, he might have lived to be 80 or 90. As a matter of fact, he was allowing himself to drift into a physical state in which even a slight malady might prove dangerous. The result was inevitable, and it came. It so happened that he and Letty had gone to the North Cape on a cruise, with a party of friends. Lester, in order to attend some important business, decided to return to Chicago late in November. He arranged to have his wife meet him in New York just before the Christmas holidays. He wrote to Watson to expect him, and engaged rooms at the Auditorium, for he had sold the Chicago residence some 2 years before, and was now living permanently in New York. One late November day, after having attended to a number of details and cleared up his affairs very materially, Lester was seized with what the doctor who was called to attend him described as a cold in the intestines, a disturbance usually symptomatic of some other weakness, either of the blood or of some organ. He suffered great pain, and the usual remedies in that case were applied. There were bandages of red flannel with a mustard dressing, and specifics were also administered. He experienced some relief, but he was troubled with a sense of impending disaster. He had Watson cable his wife. There was nothing serious about it, but he was ill. A trained nurse was in attendance, and his valet stood guard at the door to prevent annoyance of any kind. It was plain that Letty could not reach Chicago under 3 weeks. He had the feeling that he would not see her again. Curiously enough, not only because he was in Chicago, but because he had never been spiritually separated from Jennie, he was thinking about her constantly at this time. He had intended to go out and see her just as soon as he was through with his business engagements and before he left the city. He had asked Watson how she was getting along, and had been informed that everything was well with her. She was living quietly and looking in good health, so Watson said. Lester wished he could see her. This thought grew as the days passed, and he grew no better. He was suffering from time to time with severe attacks of gripping pains that seemed to tie his viscera into knots and left him very weak. Several times the physician administered cocaine with a needle in order to relieve him of useless pain. After one of the severe attacks he called Watson to his side, told him to send the nurse away, and then said, "Watson, I'd like to have you do me a favor. Ask Mrs. Stover if she won't come here to see me. You'd better go and get her. Just send the nurse and Kozo, the valet, away for the afternoon, or while she's here. If she comes at any other time, I'd like to have her admitted." Watson understood. He liked this expression of sentiment. He was sorry for Jennie. He was sorry for Lester. He wondered what the world would think if it could know of this bit of romance in connection with so prominent a man. Lester was decent. He had made Watson prosperous. The latter was only too glad to serve him in any way. He called a carriage and rode out to Jennie's residence. He found her watering some plants. Her face expressed her surprise at his unusual presence. "I come on a rather troublesome errand, Mrs. Stover," he said, using her assumed name. "That is, Mr. Kane is quite sick at the Auditorium. His wife is in Europe, and he wanted to know if I wouldn't come out here and ask you to come and see him. He wanted me to bring you, if possible. Could you come with me now?" "Why, yes," said Jennie, her face a study. The children were in school. An old Swedish housekeeper was in the kitchen. She could go as well as not. But there was coming back to her in detail a dream she had had several nights before. It had seemed to her that she was out on a dark, mystic body of water, over which was hanging something like a fog, or a pall of smoke. She had heard the water ripple or stir faintly, and then out of the surrounding darkness a boat appeared. It was a little boat, oarless or not visibly propelled, and in it were her mother and Vesta and someone whom she could not make out. Her mother's face was pale and sad, very much as she had often seen it in life. She looked at Jennie solemnly, sympathetically, and then suddenly Jennie realized that the third occupant of the boat was Lester. He looked at her gloomily, an expression she had never seen on his face before. And then her mother remarked, "Well, we must go now." The boat began to move. A great sense of loss came over her, and she cried, "Oh, don't leave me, Mama." But her mother only looked at her out of deep, sad, still eyes, and the boat was gone. She woke with a start, half fancying that Lester was beside her. She stretched out her hand to touch his arm, and then she drew herself up in the dark and rubbed her eyes, realizing that she was alone. A great sense of depression remained with her, and for 2 days it haunted her. Then, when it seemed as if it were nothing, Mr. Watson appeared with his ominous message. She went to dress and reappeared, looking as troubled as were her thoughts. She was very pleasing in her appearance, yet a sweet, kindly woman, well dressed and shapely. She had never been separated mentally from Lester, just as he had never grown entirely away from her. She was always with him in thought, just as in the years when they were together. Her fondest memories were of the days when he first courted her in Cleveland, the day when he had carried her off, much as the cave man seized his mate, by force. Now she longed to do what she could do for him. For this call was as much a testimony as a shock. He loved her, after all. The carriage rolled briskly through the long streets into the smoky downtown district. It arrived at the Auditorium, and Jennie was escorted to Lester's room. Watson had been considerate. He had talked little, leaving her to her thoughts. In this great hotel she felt diffident after so long a period of complete retirement. As she entered the room she looked at Lester with large, gray, sympathetic eyes. He was lying propped up on 2 pillows, his solid head, with its growth of once dark brown hair, slightly grayed. He looked at her curiously out of his wise old eyes, a light of sympathy and affection shining in them, weary as they were. Jennie was greatly distressed. His pale face, slightly drawn from suffering, cut her like a knife. She took his hand, which was outside the coverlet, and pressed it. She leaned over and kissed his lips. "I'm so sorry, Lester," she murmured. "I'm so sorry. You're not very sick, though, are you? You must get well, Lester, and soon." She patted his hand gently. "Yes, Jennie, but I'm pretty bad," he said. "I don't feel right about this business. I don't seem able to shake it off. But tell me, how have you been?" "Oh, just the same, dear," she replied. "I'm all right. You mustn't talk like that, though. You're going to be all right very soon now." He smiled grimly. "Do you think so?" He shook his head, for he thought differently. "Sit down, dear," he went on. "I'm not worried about that. I want to talk to you again. I want you near me." He sighed and shut his eyes for a minute. She drew up a chair close beside the bed, her face toward his, and took his hand. It seemed such a beautiful thing that he should send for her. Her eyes showed the mingled sympathy, affection, and gratitude of her heart. At the same time, fear gripped her. How ill he looked! "I can't tell what may happen," he went on. "Letty is in Europe. I wanted to see you again for some time. I was coming out this trip. We are living in New York, you know. You're a little stouter, Jennie." "Yes, I'm getting old, Lester," she smiled. "Oh, that doesn't make any difference," he replied, looking at her fixedly. "Age doesn't count. We are all in that boat. It's how we feel about life." He stopped and stared at the ceiling. A slight twinge of pain reminded him of the vigorous seizures he had been through. He couldn't stand many more paroxysms like the last one. "I couldn't go, Jennie, without seeing you again," he observed, when the slight twinge ceased and he was free to think again. "I always wanted to say to you, Jennie," he went on, "that I haven't been satisfied with the way we parted. It wasn't the right thing, after all. I haven't been any happier. I'm sorry. I wish now, for my own peace of mind, that I hadn't done it." "Don't say that, Lester," she demurred, going over in her mind all that had been between them. This was such a testimony to their real union, their real spiritual compatibility. "It's all right. It doesn't make any difference. You've been very good to me. I wouldn't have been satisfied to have you lose your fortune. It couldn't be that way. I've been a lot better satisfied as it is. It's been hard, but, dear, everything is hard at times." She paused. "No," he said, "it wasn't right. The thing wasn't worked out right from the start. But that wasn't your fault. I'm sorry. I wanted to tell you that. I'm glad I'm here to do it." "Don't talk that way, Lester. Please don't," she pleaded. "It's all right. You needn't be sorry. There's nothing to be sorry for. You have always been so good to me. Why, when I think—" She stopped, for it was hard for her to speak. She was choking with affection and sympathy. She pressed his hands. She was recalling the house he took for her family in Cleveland, his generous treatment of Gerhardt, all the long ago tokens of love and kindness. "Well, I've told you now, and I feel better. You're a good woman, Jennie, and you're kind to come to me this way. I loved you. I love you now. I want to tell you that. It seems strange, but you're the only woman I ever did truly love. We should never have parted." Jennie caught her breath. It was the one thing she had waited for all these years, this testimony. It was the one thing that could make everything right, this confession of spiritual, if not material, union. Now she could live happily. Now die so. "Oh, Lester!" she exclaimed with a sob, and pressed his hand. He returned the pressure. There was a little silence. Then he spoke again. "How are the two orphans?" he asked. "Oh, they're lovely," she answered, entering upon a detailed description of their diminutive personalities. He listened comfortably, for her voice was soothing to him. Her whole personality was grateful to him. When it came time for her to go, he seemed desirous of keeping her. "Going, Jennie?" "I can stay just as well as not, Lester," she volunteered. "I'll take a room. I can send a note out to Mrs. Swenson. It will be all right." "You needn't do that," he said, but she could see that he wanted her, that he did not want to be alone. From that time on, until the hour of his death, she was not out of the hotel. End of chapter 61. Chapter 62 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The end came after 4 days, during which Jennie was by his bedside almost constantly. The nurse in charge welcomed her at first as a relief and company, but the physician was inclined to object. Lester, however, was stubborn. "This is my death," he said, with a touch of grim humor. "If I am dying, I ought to be allowed to die in my own way." Watson smiled at the man's unfaltering courage. He had never seen anything like it before. There were cards of sympathy, calls of inquiry, notices in the newspaper. Robert saw an item in the Inquirer and decided to go to Chicago. Imogene called with her husband, and they were admitted to Lester's room for a few minutes after Jennie had gone to hers. Lester had little to say. The nurse cautioned them that he was not to be talked to much. When they were gone, Lester said to Jennie, "Imogene has changed a good deal." He made no other comment. Mrs. Kane was on the Atlantic, 3 days out from New York, the afternoon Lester died. He had been meditating whether anything more could be done for Jennie, but he could not make up his mind about it. Certainly it was useless to leave her more money. She did not want it. He had been wondering where Letty was and how near her actual arrival might be when he was seized with a tremendous paroxysm of pain. Before relief could be administered in the shape of an anesthetic, he was dead. It developed afterward that it was not the intestinal trouble which killed him, but a lesion of a major blood vessel in the brain. Jennie, who had been strongly wrought up by watching and worrying, was beside herself with grief. He had been a part of her thought and feeling so long that it seemed now as though a part of herself had died. She had loved him as she had fancied she could never love anyone, and he had always shown that he cared for her, at least in some degree. She could not feel the emotion that expresses itself in tears, only a dull ache, a numbness which seemed to make her insensible to pain. He looked so strong, her Lester, lying there still in death. His expression was unchanged, defiant, determined, albeit peaceful. Word had come from Mrs. Kane that she would arrive on the Wednesday following. It was decided to hold the body. Jennie learned from Mr. Watson that it was to be transferred to Cincinnati, where the Paces had a vault. Because of the arrival of various members of the family, Jennie withdrew to her own home. She could do nothing more. The final ceremonies presented a peculiar commentary on the anomalies of existence. It was arranged with Mrs. Kane by wire that the body should be transferred to Imogene's residence, and the funeral held from there. Robert, who arrived the night Lester died, Barry Dodge, Imogene's husband, Mr. Midgley, and 3 other citizens of prominence were selected as pallbearers. Louise and her husband came from Buffalo, Amy and her husband from Cincinnati. The house was full to overflowing with citizens who either sincerely wished or felt it expedient to call. Because of the fact that Lester and his family were tentatively Catholic, a Catholic priest was called in, and the ritual of that church was carried out. It was curious to see him lying in the parlor of this alien residence, candles at his head and feet, burning sepulchrally, a silver cross upon his breast, caressed by his waxen fingers. He would have smiled if he could have seen himself, but the Kane family was too conventional, too set in its convictions, to find anything strange in this. The church made no objection, of course. The family was distinguished. What more could be desired? On Wednesday, Mrs. Kane arrived. She was greatly distraught, for her love, like Jennie's, was sincere. She left her room that night when all was silent and leaned over the coffin, studying by the light of the burning candles Lester's beloved features. Tears trickled down her cheek, for she had been happy with him. She caressed his cold cheeks and hands. "Poor dear Lester," she whispered. "Poor brave soul! No one told her that he had sent for Jennie. The Kane family did not know. Meanwhile, in the house on South Park Avenue sat a woman who was enduring alone the pain, the anguish of an irreparable loss. Through all these years the subtle hope had persisted in spite of every circumstance that somehow life might bring him back to her. He had come, it is true. He really had in death, but he had gone again. Where? Whither her mother, whither Gerhardt, whither Vesta had gone. She could not hope to see him again, for the papers had informed her of his removal to Mrs. Midgely's residence, and of the fact that he was to be taken from Chicago to Cincinnati for burial. The last ceremonies in Chicago were to be held in one of the wealthy Roman Catholic churches of the South Side, St. Michael's, of which the Midgeleys were members. Jennie felt deeply about this. She would have liked so much to have had him buried in Chicago, where she could go to the grave occasionally, but this was not to be. She was never a master of her fate. Others invariably controlled. She thought of him as being taken from her finally by the removal of the body to Cincinnati, as though distance made any difference. She decided at last to veil herself heavily and attend the funeral at the church. The paper had explained that the service would be at 2 in the afternoon. Then at 4 the body would be taken to the depot and transferred to the train. The members of the family would accompany it to Cincinnati. She thought of this as another opportunity. She might go to the depot. A little before the time for the funeral cortege to arrive at the church, there appeared at one of its subsidiary entrances a woman in black, heavily veiled, who took a seat in an inconspicuous corner. She was a little nervous at first, for seeing that the church was dark and empty, she feared lest she had mistaken the time and place. But after 10 minutes of painful suspense, a bell in the church tower began to toll solemnly. Shortly thereafter an acolyte in black gown and white surplice appeared and lighted a group of candles on either side of the altar. A hushed stirring of feet in the choir loft indicated that the service was to be accompanied by music. Some loiterers, attracted by the bell, some idle strangers, a few acquaintances and citizens not directly invited, appeared and took seats. Jennie watched all this with wondering eyes. Never in her life had she been inside a Catholic church. The gloom, the beauty of the windows, the whiteness of the altar, the golden flames of the candles impressed her. She was suffused with a sense of sorrow, loss, beauty, and mystery. Life in all its vagueness and uncertainty seemed typified by this scene. As the bell tolled, there came from the sacristy a procession of altar boys. The smallest, an angelic youth of 11, came first, bearing aloft a magnificent silver cross. In the hands of each subsequent pair of servitors was held a tall, lighted candle. The priest in black cloth and lace, attended by an acolyte on either hand, followed. The procession passed out the entrance into the vestibule of the church, and was not seen again until the choir began a mournful, responsive chant, the Latin supplication for mercy and peace. Then at this sound the solemn procession made its reappearance. There came the silver cross, the candles, the dark-faced priest reading dramatically to himself as he walked, and the body of Lester in a great black coffin with silver handles carried by the pallbearers, who kept an even pace. Jennie stiffened perceptibly, her nerves responding as though to a shock from an electric current. She did not know any of these men. She did not know Robert. She had never seen Mr. Midgely. Of the long company of notables who followed 2 by 2, she recognized only 3, whom Lester had pointed out to her in past times. Mrs. Kane she saw, of course, for she was directly behind the coffin, leaning on the arm of a stranger. Behind her walked Mr. Watson, solemn, gracious. He gave a quick glance to either side, evidently expecting to see her somewhere, but not finding her. He turned his eyes gravely forward and walked on. Jennie looked with all her eyes, her heart gripped by pain. She seemed so much a part of this solemn ritual, yet infinitely removed from it all. The procession reached the altar rail, and the coffin was put down. A white shroud bearing the insignia of suffering, a black cross, was put over it, and the great candles were set beside it. There were chanted invocations and responses, the sprinkling of the coffin with holy water, the lighting and swinging of the censer, and then the mumbled responses of the auditors to the Lord's Prayer and to its Catholic edition, the Invocation to the Blessed Virgin. Jennie was overawed and amazed, but no show of form colorful, impression imperial could take away the sting of death, the sense of infinite loss. To Jennie the candles, the incense, the holy song were beautiful. They touched a deep chord of melancholy in her and made it vibrate through the depths of her being. She was as a house filled with mournful melody and the presence of death. She cried and cried. She could see, curiously, that Mrs. Kane was sobbing convulsively also. When it was all over, the carriages were entered and the body was borne to the station. All the guests and strangers departed, and finally, when all was silent, she arose. Now she would go to the depot also, for she was hopeful of seeing his body put on the train. They would have to bring it out on the platform, just as they did in Vesta's case. She took a car, and a little later she entered the waiting room of the depot. She lingered about, first in the concourse, where the great iron fence separated the passengers from the tracks, and then in the waiting room, hoping to discover the order of proceedings. She finally observed the group of immediate relatives waiting: Mrs. Kane, Robert, Mrs. Midgely, Louise, Amy, Imogene, and the others. She actually succeeded in identifying most of them, though it was not knowledge in this case, but pure instinct and intuition. No one had noticed in the stress of excitement, but it was Thanksgiving Eve. Throughout the great railroad station there was a hum of anticipation, that curious ebullition of fancy which springs from the thought of pleasure to come. People were going away for the holiday. Carriages were at the station entries. Announcers were calling in stentorian voices the destination of each new train as the time of its departure drew near. Jennie heard with a desperate ache the description of a route which she and Lester had taken more than once, slowly and melodiously emphasized: Detroit, Toledo, Cleveland, Buffalo, and New York. There were cries for trains for Fort Wayne, Columbus, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and points east, and then finally for Indianapolis, Louisville, Columbus, Cincinnati, and points south. The hour had struck. Several times Jennie had gone to the concourse between the waiting room and the track to see if through the iron grating which separated her from her beloved she could get one last look at the coffin or the great wooden box which held it before it was put on the train. Now she saw it coming. There was a baggage porter pushing a truck into position near the place where the baggage car would stop. On it was Lester, the last shadow of his substance, encased in the honors of wood and cloth and silver. There was no thought on the part of the porter of the agony of loss which was represented here. He could not see how wealth and position in this hour were typified to her mind as a great fence, a wall, which divided her eternally from her beloved. Had it not always been so? Was not her life a patchwork of conditions made and affected by these things which she saw, wealth and force which had found her unfit? She had evidently been born to yield, not seek. This panoply of power had been paraded before her since childhood. What could she do now but stare vaguely after it as it marched triumphantly by? Lester had been of it. Him it respected. Of her it knew nothing. She looked through the grating, and once more there came the cry of Indianapolis, Louisville, Columbus, Cincinnati, and points south. A long red train, brilliantly lighted, composed of baggage cars, day coaches, a dining car set with white linen and silver, and a half a dozen comfortable Pullmans, rolled in and stopped. A great black engine, puffing and glowing, had it all safely in tow. As the baggage car drew near the waiting truck, a train hand in blue, looking out of the car, called to someone within. "Hey, Jack, give us a hand here. There's a stiff outside." Jennie could not hear. All she could see was the great box that was so soon to disappear. All she could feel was that this train would start presently, and then it would all be over. The gates opened. The passengers poured out. There were Robert and Amy and Louise and Midgely, all making for the Pullman cars in the rear. They had said their farewells to their friend. No need to repeat them. A trio of assistants gave a hand at getting the great wooden case into the car. Jennie saw it disappear with an acute physical wrench at her heart. There were many trunks to be put aboard, and then the door of the baggage car half closed. But not before the warning bell of the engine sounded. There was the insistent calling of "All aboard!" from this quarter and that. Then slowly the great locomotive began to move. Its bell was ringing, its steam hissing, its smokestack throwing aloft a great black plume of smoke that fell back over the cars like a pall. The fireman, conscious of the heavy load behind, flung open a flaming furnace door to throw in coal. Its light glowed like a golden eye. Jennie stood rigid, staring into the wonder of this picture, her face white, her eyes wide, her hands unconsciously clasped. But one thought in her mind: they were taking his body away. A leaden November sky was ahead, almost dark. She looked and looked until the last glimmer of the red lamp on the receding sleeper disappeared in the maze of smoke and haze overhanging the tracks of the far-stretching yard. "Yes," said the voice of a passing stranger, gay with the anticipation of coming pleasures. "We're going to have a great time down there. Remember Annie? Uncle Jim is coming, and Aunt Ella." Jennie did not hear that or anything else of the chatter and bustle around her. Before her was stretching a vista of lonely years, down which she was steadily gazing. Now what? She was not so old yet. There were those two orphan children to raise. They would marry and leave after a while, and then what? Days and days in endless reiteration, and then... End of chapter 62. Recording by Richard Kilmer, Rio Medina, Texas. End of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER.